on the church. So.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you think
I'd like to call this meeting of the Urbana City Council to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Here.
Ms. Shenoweth? Present. Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat? Present. Mr. Roberts?
Here.
Mr. Whalen?
here?
Ms. Wyman? Present. Mayor Satterthwaite?
Here. We have a quorum. First item on our agenda this evening is approval of the minutes of the previous meeting. Is there a motion?
Move approval. Second.
I have a
A
question.
motion and a second. Are there discussion or questions? Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, there was an error in the minutes. Page 9. It was the ordinance about the contained electrical cabinets and the antenna on the roof of the apartment building. And in that vote, I had voted no, and I think the minutes show that Councilman Alex was recorded as voting no, but he voted yes. So you might as well get that right.
Okay, is there any objection to having the minutes show that Mr. Roberts voted nay and Mr. Alex voting aye then, right?
Yes.
Objection to that? Okay. Go ahead and do that. Any other additions or corrections? Any discussion? Not. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Any additions or corrections to the agenda this evening? Petitions and communications, we have many. For folks, if you would keep your comments brief and try not to be repetitive if that's at all possible, and you'll have a choice. You can speak now or you can speak at the time of the agenda item. If you choose to speak at the time of the agenda item, what will happen is we'll get the staff presentation first, then you'll be able to have your public participation, and then we'll go to council discussion and debate after that. When your name comes up, just let me know. If you don't want to speak now, let me know if you'd like to speak at the time of the agenda item, and you'll have a chance to do so. If you don't want to speak at all and just want to have be on record as in favor or against a particular thing, well, let us know that as well. First is Richard Underwood, 2401 Pond on the Presbyterian Church.
Speak later.
You want to speak at the time of the agenda? Okay. Okay. Wayne Badger of 806 Jody and Muhammad.
I don't wish to speak.
Don't wish to speak? Okay.
I'm just registering my...
Support for the variance of at the Presbyterian Church, okay. Cindy Strelo of 709 South Anderson. Do you not want to speak? Okay. And supporting, okay. Not wanting to speak and supporting the variance. E.D. Lee at 403 East Holmes.
I will speak later.
Speak later, okay. Reverend Mason,
I'll hold till later.
still later. Okay. Augusta Strozak,
I'm here for support. I don't want to speak.
don't want to speak, okay, but in favor of the variance,
Yes.
okay. Katrina Good,
I don't care to speak, but I just want to show my support.
okay, support but does not wish to speak on the variance. Harold Geither, 613 Harding,
I do not wish to speak, but I support the variance.
okay. Ann Ricker, 703 West Washington,
Not speaking, registering support.
okay. Maria Ryan, 1 Buena Vista Court,
I prefer to speak at the time the agenda item comes up.
agenda item. Elizabeth Greeley, 2206 Curitin,
I don't wish to speak, but I'm registering support.
okay, support of the variance, does not wish to speak. Kristen Weber Borbely, am I pronouncing that right?
I need to speak to supporting the variance.
Supporting the variance, okay. En Suk Byun,
I don't wish to speak. I'm
Oh.
here for the support.
okay, supporting the variance but does not wish to speak, okay. Jay Lee, 403 East Holmes,
I'm here just to support the variance.
in support of the variance but does not wish to speak. Jin Suk Byung,
I don't want to speak, but I'm here to support.
okay, here in support, okay. Lynn McDade, St. Joe,
Don't wish to speak, but support the variance.
support the variance, okay. Christelle Spellmeyer,
Don't wish to speak, but in support.
okay. Nani Baker, 1707 Cindy,
Don't wish to speak, but I support the variance.
okay. Michelle Ham, 408 Floral Park Drive,
Sorry, I think somebody else put my name on there again. Sorry.
okay. So, okay,
This one was my legal name, and the second one was my calling name, and I believe someone else just put my name on there.
but again, does not,
Yes.
don't wish to speak? Okay,
Just support the variance.
all right, thanks. And then, Jong Hwan with the same address?
Speak later.
You'll speak later? Okay. Ju Chiu Jun,
Yes. I don't want to speak. Just supporting.
you're supporting but do not wish to speak? Okay. Linda Lorenz, 409 West High, on the variance at 608 West Green.
I'll just say something.
Okay.
I live in the neighborhood about 2 blocks away from the church. I grew up here. As I've told you many times, I bought in the neighborhood so that I could walk to the library and ride my bike to work. Every variance that you allow destroys the residential character of our neighborhood and lowers the property values when we try to sell. I ride my bike past the church and its ugly parking lot at least twice a day, almost every day, and I don't want to see one more big, huge Barney thing on our street, which is not consistent with the rest of our neighborhood and which destroys where we live. So I would like to see some changes before they're allowed to build. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? All right, thank you. Next is Brian Adams, 412 West Elm, on the church expansion.
I can wait till later.
You want to wait till the time of the agenda item? All right. Nancy Whaling at 2 Buena Vista Court,
Speak at the time of the
at the time of the agenda item, all right. Jack Stager, 102 West Vermont.
No speak, but supporting the variance.
Okay, thank you. Eva Steiger, 102 West Vermont.
I support the variance, but I don't wish to speak.
Okay, thank you. Jim Locker, 1201 South Orchard.
Contrary to my personality, I will not speak, but I do speak.
All right. Thank you. And Christina Locker, 1201 South Orchard.
Not speaking, but supporting.
Okay, not speaking but supporting the variance. Ilona Matkovsky, 412 West Elm.
later.
You want to speak later? Okay. Agenda item. Tom Rauchfuss, 706 West Iowa.
I'll speak now,
Speak now? Okay.
briefly. Just briefly, I'm from the neighborhood that would be affected, and I am generally opposed to new parking lots or new large structures that diminish the quality of the family-oriented neighborhood that we live in. I also work for the university and am involved heavily with recruitment of talent from outside, and one of the strengths that we have for recruiting is the residential neighborhoods surrounding university. And as we stepwise degrade these for the fraternity houses and the sororities and for the churches, we actually hurt my ability to recruit high-quality talent from cities that have more strict zoning regulations that protect family-oriented neighborhoods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is Suki Stover of 803 Park Lane.
I will not speak, but I will support.
Doesn't wish to speak, but in support of the variance. John Chato, 714 West Vermont.
Not to talk, and support variance.
Supports the variance, but does not wish to speak. Barclay Jones, 310 East Holmes.
Don't wish to speak, but support the variance.
Okay, not speaking, but supporting the variance. All right, well, anybody else?
There's one more comment.
Okay. Janice Mitchell, she's one of the appointments coming up in just a minute, but makes herself available for questions. You just want to wait till the agenda item? Okay. Okay. Any petitions or communications from members of the council? Yeah, Mr. Alex.
We'd just like to make a comment that the primary election is tomorrow. At that election, we will go a long way to electing a nearly entirely new city council, and of course electing a mayor as well. And even though you can't vote for me, I would encourage everyone in Urbana who's eligible to get out there and vote tomorrow.
Thank you. Any other petitions and communications from council members? Yes, Joe?
I too would suggest and encourage anybody to vote, whether you signed a petition or not. Well, I think that issue is debatable and will be probably settled later in court. I also wish to announce that I have been given an award.
Oh.
Yes, imagine this.
Congratulations.
And this is from our news reporter, Mike Monson. I won $1 from him on the Super Bowl. Thank you, Mike.
So mark that date down. Mike get off of that. Okay. Any other petitions and communications? Yes, Mr.
As
Allen.
a follow-up to that, I think we should point out that presumably neither the News Gazette nor the Urbana City Council condones sports betting.
Okay. Well, we'll go on to old business then. We have a couple items of old business. 2 mayoral appointments that were deferred until this meeting. They are to the Champaign County Housing Authority Board, Janice Mitchell of 111 South Dodson. She's currently an access clinician at the Champaign County Mental Health Center, a position she's had since 2003. She received her Master's of Arts from the University of Chicago, the School of Social Service Administration, and received her bachelor's degree from Southern University A&M. She's been a resident of Urbana for 16 years. Her term will expire, if approved, June 30th, 2006. And I do want to point out that although Ms. Mitchell is a resident of Urbana, she is not within the city limits of Urbana, but that does not preclude her from serving on the Champaign County Housing Authority Board as a City of Urbana appointee. And to the Human Relations Commission, Mr. Daniel Larson of 708 East Oregon. He's currently a graduate student and teaching assistant at the University of Illinois in speech and communication and verbal communication. He received both his bachelor's and master's from the U of I and is currently working on his PhD. He's been a resident of Urbana for 27 years and has been an active volunteer in the community. His term, if approved, will expire June 30th, 2007. Any questions from council members? Not, a motion would be in order.
A move approval. Second.
A motion and a second. Any discussion? Yes, Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I've known Ms. Mitchell for, I don't know how many years, but for several years, and when she worked at Cunningham Children's Home and her involvement with the schools, and I think that she will be an excellent addition to the Housing Authority Board, and I'm very pleased to see that she was selected for this appointment.
Any other discussion? Okay, if there's no other discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Congratulations, Janice. You didn't even get any questions, so congratulations. Next, we have reports of standing committees. We have a report from the Committee of the Whole. Mr. Whalen, are you chair?
I guess so.
So.
The Committee of the Whole has the following ordinances to vote on and one resolution. Ordinance number 2005-02-019, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute a development agreement with Tatman Family, LLC. I'll move.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Any changes from last week, Mr. Walden?
No changes. I did have a chance to have a conversation with the developer, one of the council members, regarding the way the loan program works, and I think we have an understanding of how it works, and I think we're good to go. Again, Mr. Tatman's here representing the project, and if there's any further questions of me or him.
No questions or discussion?
Discussion.
Discussion, Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes, I had a brief discussion with a developer and Mr. Walden beforehand, and I think just to make clear to council members, the concern I raised, and I think Mr. Alex mirrored this somewhat last week, was, any situation where we might draw businesses from one part of Urbana to another without any kind of net increase in terms of expansion or whatnot. And so I actually didn't see the part of the development agreement last week that stated that that city staff could, at their discretion, actually determine whether or not a business met the economic development goals of the city, and if it didn't, if the relocation did not meet the economic development goals of the city, that would not be eligible for the grant loan program. So I was concerned about writing a kind of blank check. It's not a very large check, but certainly a blank check to say, well, any business that wants to move into this space, whether it's expanding, contracting, et cetera. I do not want to see the city subsidize spaces even in small ways that might draw away from other areas or create a competitive disadvantage. Certainly, Philo Road right now has the competitive disadvantage, so I don't think, I think bringing businesses into that area make a lot of sense. But this development agreement doesn't necessarily have a, could be in effect for several years, and we might see some changes on Philo Road. So that has been settled to my satisfaction, and I wanted council to know that.
Any other discussion? If there's no other discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Mayor?
Yeah.
I'd just like to say again, appreciate the efforts on the part of the developer to work through this. I think this is going to be a good project for Urbana and the kind of thing we'd like to see more of in the future.
Any other discussion? If there's no further discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
That motion carries with 7 ayes. Mr. Whalen?
Second item on the agenda is ordinance number 2005-02-020, or -020. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute a development incentive agreement with Champaign-Urbana Motel Limited Partnership. That is the Holiday Inn Express. I so move.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Discussion? Okay. If there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Okay, that motion carries with 7 ayes. Mr. Whalen?
The third item is ordinance number 2005-02-021, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an agreement for use of right-of-way, that is Kohler Avenue between University Avenue and Sassafras Alley. I so move.
Second.
I second.
Okay, you got to be quick the second round here. Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion on this? Okay, if there's no discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Okay, that motion carries with 7 ayes. Mr. Whalen?
The next item is an ordinance number 2005-02-022, an ordinance authorizing the mayor to execute an agreement with Edge Scott Fire Protection District. I so move.
I second it.
We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this?
I just have one thing to say.
Yes, Mr. Roberts?
Carthage was built by the, I can't remember her name, Dido, by cutting a bullhide into extremely narrow strips to get around the fact that she could claim as much property as she could cover by the bullhide. And here we have the Scott Edge Fire Department cutting a narrow strip to include two different diverse sections of what could be their fire protection district. But I suppose that this process, this technique, which is thousands of years old, still seems to work today, and seemingly affects the appropriate purpose for establishing a contiguous fire protection area. And so even though it's an unusual formation of land agreement, it's acceptable to me.
Okay, any other discussion? If there's no other discussion, will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
That motion carries with 7 ayes. Mr. Whalen?
Next item is a resolution, as opposed to an ordinance, number 2005-02-004R. Resolution number 2005-02-004R. And I don't know why it has to be repeated, but it is. Resolution regarding the release of closed session minutes, review period from July 2004 to January 2005. I move approval.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. This is a resolution regarding the release of closed session minutes. There is one meeting for which the minutes are proposed to be released. That was July 17th, 2004. The topic was pending litigation. Any discussion? If no discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Mr. Whalen?
Well, the next item is a report of special committees. Do we have on it?
Just want to report on the time of the next committee meeting?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. The next committee meeting will be next Monday, which is the, let's see,
28th.
28th. Thank you. I'm terrible at math. 28th of February.
Thank you, Mr. Whalen.
Yes, sir.
Next, we have reports of special committees. Any special committee reports this evening? Seeing none. Any reports of officers? Don't have any. Reports of officers this evening. We'll get right into a new business then. First is an ordinance approving a major variance to allow an increase in the maximum permitted floor area ratio, the FAR, from .70 to 1.19 at 608 West Green in the MOR Mixed Office Residential Zoning District. This was case number ZBA-04-MAJ-15. We have Mr. Kowalski to report.
Thank you. This case comes to you from the Zoning Board of Appeals. On January 12th, they unanimously recommended approval of the major variance. Again, this is the proposal by the First Presbyterian Church of Urbana to construct a 10,905 square foot addition at 608 West Green Street, and it would be an addition that would attach to the existing church on the corner of Green and Orchard street. The facility would be jointly used with between the First Presbyterian Church of Urbana and the Korean Church of Champaign-Urbana. There was an existing home located at 608 West Green Street that the church had owned for approximately 20 years or so. It's recently been removed. They had leased that home to the Korean Church of Champaign-Urbana, and they intend that the addition would serve as a new facility for that church. Of course, this is located in the mixed office residential zoning district. That district allows a floor area ratio of 0.70, calculated for a maximum 8,500 square foot of a lot. This allows essentially a 5,950 square foot structure to be built in that district. And again, the proposal is for a 10,905 square foot structure, although it is proposed to be a single-story structure with a full basement that would attach to an existing basement in the church. So visible from the street is about 5,425 square feet, and the other half of that usable gross floor area gross square footage is below grade. The handout, we gave you a handout at your desk that looks like this, and it's got two parts to it. On the back page is a little map that shows a layout of where the former structure is that was removed recently, and that's in a pink line. And then also in the yellow line is the proposed addition. And then the front page really just gives you a breakdown of some numbers of the former structure square footage, which was a little over 3,000 square feet, and then the proposed addition square footage, and also gives you some statistics for what the proposed height is and setbacks. Beyond the square footage requirements, the height is proposed to be 1 story. The former structure was a 2.5-story structure. The setbacks for the addition are proposed to be pretty much the same as the former structure at about 39-40 feet, and also would keep the same setback from the Ricker House at about 50 feet from between structures. Probably the most notable aspect of the numbers is that while the district allows a total square footage of about 5,950, the gross square footage of the addition, if it were just a single story and say built on a slab, would be a little over 5,400 square feet, which would meet the requirements for the MOR district. So it's really the addition of the full basement that requires the variance. There have been a number of steps in this process. First of all, there was a public meeting, or a neighborhood meeting, I guess, held by the church back in early January. This case also went to the Historic Preservation Commission for their review because it's next to the Ricker House, which is a local historic landmark. It then went to the Zoning Board of Appeals to hear this variance case on January 12th. On January 13th, I went to the Development Review Board, which is our newly revamped board for projects in the MOR district. They review the plan for its compatibility with the area, the aesthetics, the architectural significance, et cetera, in accordance with our MOR design guidelines that we adopted last year. That board moved approval of the plans and voted 3-1 in favor of it. However, our ordinance requires that there be a minimum of 4 aye votes in order for it to pass, so it did not pass and was automatically appealed to the Zoning Board of Appeals, which is, again, consistent with our ordinance requirements. The Zoning Board of Appeals met last week and sustained the appeal and essentially approved the site plans and considered them in compliance with the MOR design guidelines. So the consideration tonight is really for the major variance for the size of the addition. Pages 4 and 5 of your staff report outline the variance criteria that the zoning board considered, and I won't read through all those, but most notably is always the criteria that relates to a special circumstance. In this case, I think the most notable special circumstance that the zoning board found for this case is that it is a large institutional use in the MOR district, which is a little bit of an anomaly for that district. The church has been located on this spot for, I think, 140 to 150 years. The current building was built in 1964, predates the MOR requirements and the zoning ordinance for MOR. One of the intents of the district, of the MOR district, is to keep the size of structures relatively small, and that's why there are the limitations on the square footage. And I think the intent is to avoid the scenario where a developer may come in, buy up 4 or 5 lots, remove the structures, and build one large, say, apartment building. In this case, the church desires to make their structure bigger, of course, with the addition. They are asking for relief of the zoning ordinance because there are limited opportunities of how they can expand on that site and still keep the overall function and usability of the church layout, considering the way that the original building is built with the basement that can be expanded, et cetera. As you know, and as you've heard, there has been additional parking built for the church in recent years. The parking that is existing on the east side of Orchard Street and also on the north side of Elm Street is adequate, according to our regulations, to accommodate the addition. So, again, there are other criteria in the staff report, but I won't read through those. I know Gary Olson is here, patiently waiting to speak. He's the architect for the project. Pastor Mason and Dick Underhill are here also that can speak to. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Mr. Kowalski right now?
I've just got one, and it relates to this notion of special circumstances versus special privileges. In the first two criteria that were considered by ZBA, in the first case we talk about special circumstances related to the parcel, and in the second we talk about special circumstances related to the land or structure. Can you speak to the distinction between those in the zoning ordinance and whether the notion of a special circumstance is allowed to be considered with regard to an existing structure as opposed to just a piece of ground?
Well, typically how those two criteria they overlap a little bit. Number one, the special circumstance the way it reads, are there special circumstances or practical difficulties in reference to the parcel concerned in carrying out the strict application of the ordinance? I think the zoning board looked at that and felt that the location of the lot and its proximity to the church being immediately to the west, and that's where they would logically expand their building. Some of the requirements of the district that relates to that parcel creates, and we don't use the word hardship anymore, but created a little bit of a hardship for them being able to expand. The second one about the special privilege, again, I think that relates a little bit more, goes beyond the land and could talk about something about the structure as well. Maybe there's a structure that happened to be built on a property line and there's no way to expand and without encroaching into the setback. So I think the zoning board found a little bit, for number one, they found that there was some special circumstances with the land, but also within the zoning district that it's located within. So I don't know if that answers your question directly, but it overlapped a little bit.
Sort of. Okay, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions, staff? Yes, Mr. Miller.
I'm confused as to why basement square footage is included in the FAR. What's the purpose of that?
Well, if it's considered usable square footage, in which this case would be, it's calculated as part of the gross square footage. So we do subtract out mechanical rooms or other areas that are not considered usable, but if it's usable, whether it's below grade or above grade, it counts in the square footage.
And the reason for that, it's clear to me the statement that says regulations were adopted primarily in response to the construction of apartment buildings developed by really any entity on several lots to clear them for large buildings out of scale. So in that statement, the issue is scale. Is it also, is a basement considered part of the square footage in the FAR because intensity of usage is also the issue? And is that stated in our zoning ordinance, or?
No, I don't believe it's explicitly stated as such, but I think that is the primary intent. I mean, if you've got a full usable basement, that obviously will increase the use a little bit, or it could be used a little more intensely. There isn't much in our zoning ordinance besides the MOR design guidelines that really address scale of a neighborhood and, whether a structure aesthetically fits in or, relates to the other heights of the buildings on the block face and that kind of thing. So it's really geared more towards the intensity of use, I believe.
Okay. And I assume that an expansion like this, which I do have the numbers in front of me, they're just under a bunch of piece of paper. Expansion significant in terms of square footage will mean an expansion of the intensity of use. But you said that there isn't additional parking planned with this particular expansion? So you're saying that the parking that exists accommodates at least the parking part of the intensity of use is taken care of?
According to our regulations, yeah.
And so there will be no parking. I see there's no parking on this particular lot. Is that correct?
There's no proposal for new parking areas now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And would they be allowed to put parking in the future on this lot?
Well, the way they have laid out the addition, I think it would make it difficult for them to provide a parking area that would meet our design specifications and be out of the setback, et cetera.
Okay.
So I don't think it'd be possible for them to install parking in the front yard.
Is there? I have one additional question. The original I saw some blueprints for the expansion of the church, which I know were probably just various visions, but it included this, and it also included the demolition of the yellow house on Elm Street and the creation of a gymnasium. Now, I know that that's not what's before us this evening, but with this statement which says that the regulations were adopted so that an entity doesn't take a bunch of lots and demolish things and create a large structure on it, that's exactly what the plan that I saw does. It's exactly contrary to this. Now, so the question is, are we piecemealing towards that? Okay, let me ask the staff question. The staff question is there a limit to the number of lots one institutional development can use in the MOR district, or is it infinite?
No, there's no specific number of how many lots a use can use, any use, whether it's institutional or single family or multifamily. And any further expansion that may be proposed by the church would have to go through a similar process. Of course, would have to comply with the regulations in the MOR district, which requires a hearing with the Development Review Board. So they wouldn't have any permission by right to expand their facilities, but they would have to get approval to do that. I can't really speak to their long-range plans. That might be a better question for Pastor Mason.
Okay. I'll do that then. So let me just ask you a follow-up question. Is there a limit to the square footage size of a particular development? So say there's the church, there's the addition, the Korean church addition, and then there would be perhaps an addition on the back. Can it basically be that you can take some kind of structure in the MOR and keep building additions onto it?
Well,
And you're saying that the Development Review Board would review that, but is there any prohibition to doing that via ordinance, or is it really a case-by-case basis with the Development Review Board?
I think it's a case-by-case. We'd have to see what they proposed. We reviewed this one based on the addition itself and the square footage of it and the lot that it's going to be on. It could be difficult, and I don't have the layout envisioned in my head, but it could be difficult on the north side to make that kind of calculation where an addition is pretty much on its own lot. It may be hard to do that and still meet the intent of the MOR district, but that's something we'd have to review with them as they put a plan together.
Okay.
But to answer your question, there isn't a specific cap.
So there's no specific cap on square footage of a given, so something like the apartments to the east, I can't remember the names.
Campus Oaks.
Campus Oaks, where the Oaks used to be. The apartments, Campus Oaks, something like that that's one structure that goes over several lots that is possible in the MOR, but only with approval of the Development Review Board.
I think the biggest difference between the proposed expansion of the church and a proposed expansion of, say, Campus Oaks is the zoning board felt that the church had limited options for how it could expand and not expand from the current structure. And we saw that with the Twin City Bible Church and probably 4 or 5 other churches over the last 3 years. They have a desire to expand their current facilities, whether it's a narthex area or, a seating area or something like that. I think if an apartment building came in and wanted to expand, obviously they'd want to expand on that building for the sole purpose of adding additional units and not necessarily to make some units bigger. I guess that's a possibility. In that case, I think it would, be highly encouraged that if they want to build a new apartment building on an adjacent lot, it should be its own freestanding building that meets the requirements of the code and not necessarily an expansion of an existing building. But the board felt that this was a little bit of a unique scenario with a large institutional use that needed to expand and still keep an existing building functional.
And just this, my last, it's kind of part of all of the same question. Is it possible, not to say necessarily this council would do it, but just to understand the landscape of possibility, is it possible that one of the conditions that we could add, in addition to, say, the ZBA conditions, too many acronyms, the ZBA conditions would be something like, another condition would be that there shall be no additional expansion to this building, for example. Is that something that the city council, it's permissible for the city council to add as a condition so that an expansion like this may fit the special conditions, but any further expansion would be against the spirit of the zoning ordinance regarding MOR, the one that I quoted? Is it possible for us to then create that condition?
That's really hard for me to answer. There's always needs to be an avenue of relief that can be requested if there's a proposal made that should be considered in a public forum and at a public hearing and ultimately considered by the city council. I'm not aware of a case that we've had recently where we said you can expand but not anymore, even without consideration through a public hearing.
Didn't we say, don't we have an agreement with the University of Illinois that they can't expand past the H Street, whatever that street is, the one just west, Harvey Street? Is that correct?
We have a letter of understanding with the university that they won't expand past Harvey.
Okay. So it's possible to have a letter of understanding with the church, for example. I mean, I'm trying to understand the legal, the landscape and precedents, et cetera. I'm not trying to be provocative. I see everyone kind of smirking, but I'm just trying to understand what's permissible, what isn't, and what would be appropriate. I think the situation that we have here is we have an expansion that in many ways is extremely reasonable and has this kind of basement capacity, and at the same time, there's kind of this question of, is this phase 1, a phase 2, a phase 3, a phase 4, and before we know it, we've kind of piecemealed ourselves way out of compliance with what we really think belongs in the MOR district. Anyway, I'll stop there with my questions, and I'll hear further input and things like that.
Any other questions, Ms. Pratt?
Thank you. Well, I'll just follow up with Ms. Chenoweth. If the council were to impose such a requirement, if we couldn't a future council just reverse it?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. And then one other question, this was actually the one I wanted to ask, and this isn't, it's not significant, but it's I keep seeing different numbers of square feet in the description of the project, and I think it might just be numbers being transposed, because on the handout we were given and on the original ZBA plan, it said the proposed addition will be 10,900 square feet. Folks from the church who've called me have said 10,090, and I'm wondering which is the correct number. Or maybe Mr. Olson, I guess, is the one who would know that.
That was going to be my first statement. I've seen 3 different numbers tonight as well. The actual number is 10,095, 10095, and 5,080 is above grade, 5,015 is below grade.
Thank you.
Mr. Roberts?
I have a question for Mr. Olson, too, and it's just so that I understand the floor plan of the church, which we've been given this kind of diagrammatic. We've seen this one before. Can you give me the dimensions of the length of the proposed addition and its width?
80 feet long, 50 feet wide, and then there's a circular extension to the south.
And the circular extension, does that extend 20 feet past the 50 feet?
Yes.
It's a 20-foot extension. Okay. In comparison to that, can you tell me what the width and the depth of the original sanctuary is, the current sanctuary that you use?
I don't have that number here, but it's slightly wider, about 56, I think, and it's about maybe 100 feet long.
Okay, so a new addition is basically within 20 feet of length, the same size as the sanctuary that we see standing now on Green Street. So it's basically the size. It's almost the size of the sanctuary, just turned sideways and added to the left flank of the church. Is that correct?
The massing will be significantly different, but yes.
The massing will be different, but
yes, the area.
But the dimension area is approximately the same, just at a different access.
It's smaller, but
by 6 feet in one direction and 20 feet on the other.
Correct.
Okay, because I'm trying to get an understanding of really how large the structure is. And how tall will the rooftop reach?
I think it's stated as 18 feet 9 inches.
18 feet above ground level?
Oh, yes.
And on the church, okay, and the church main sanctuary, it must go up to about like 26 or something? You know?
I'd just be guessing. I think it's higher than, I think it's closer to 35.
Because I know it looks quite huge in comparison to some of the other structures on the block. And I'm just trying to understand the total dimensions of the building that you're asking to add on to it. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Allen.
I had a couple of follow-ups for Mr. Kowalski, and one of them was touches on one thing Ms. Chenoweth raised, and that's this issue of the intent behind the FAR requirements, either specific to the MOR district or in the zoning ordinance generally. In the cases I've been familiar with where we've discussed FAR, it has always been my impression that the primary goal of the FAR requirement was related to lot coverage and building mass. And I thought I heard you say a minute ago that you thought the primary issue was related to intensity of use. And I'm wondering if you want to speak to that, or maybe this is something that Dr. Tyler would want to speak to as to how historically we've looked at FAR from a regulatory standpoint.
I think all those things, intensity, mass, scale,
so
in different ways. We don't have bulk requirements. We just have nothing else.
I mean, the graphic in the zoning ordinance shows one of a certain amount of the lot being covered. You know, if it's a 0.25, it's a quarter of the lot, et cetera. But I think they go hand in hand. I mean, how much of the land you cover with building has an impact to how intense the lot's going to be used. A lot of zoning codes across the country will use, for residential, they'll use density indicator of dwelling units per acre, 4.84 dwelling units per acre, and that goes up as you get into multifamily.
I understand. I'm not talking about intensity in the lot coverage sense. I'm talking about intensity in the performance-based sense. I mean, the notion that impact in terms of traffic or noise or what, basically these externalities is going to be somehow rolled into FAR, and that's something I had never really considered before in discussions of FAR, and I just wanted to get sort of your opinion on the degree to which it was appropriate to consider that as a component of FAR as opposed to these more conventional sort of physical planning issues of lot coverage and building scale?
Well, at the risk of sounding like I'm talking out of two sides of my mouth, I think the zoning ordinance looks at it more in the sense of how much of the lot is covered by building, and doesn't get into specifics about, an assumption of how intense the use is. But I really do think they go hand in hand. The bigger building you have, the more it's going to be used, the more intense it's going to be.
And I guess my reason for believing that it's primarily a lot coverage issue is that we don't, and correct me if I'm wrong, but we don't differentiate floor area ratios based on type of use. We only differentiate floor area ratios based on zoning district. So in other words, if you're building a school, or you're building a warehouse, or you're building a office building, or you're building an apartment, the same FAR applies. And presumably, if this were designed to be an intensity of use issue, we would factor in the use class as opposed to just the zoning district into the FAR formula? I guess that's not an unanswerable question.
Yeah,
I'm just trying to get to the intent behind the FAR restriction, because I think that's really the crux of this case.
We have other development requirements that kick into effect depending on what the land is actually being used for, such as parking and landscaping, et cetera, signage. Depending on what it's actually being used for, not how big it is, but what it's being used for, and in some cases how big it is for, say, parking, then other development factors kick in. So,
my second question relates to the Development Review Board. My understanding is that this went to the Development Review Board. This would have gone to the Development Review Board regardless of the request for a variance, because it is new construction in the MOR district, right? So this really got to ZBA sort of from two sides. It got to ZBA by virtue of being a major variance request, and then it went to ZBA by virtue of this quirk in the bylaws of the DRB that allowed them to have a quorum but not render an approval.
Right. That's correct.
Okay. On the particular issue then of the Development Review Board, one of the things that I remember was discussed at the Plan Commission level during the creation of the design guidelines, and I remember Ms. Gosha on the Plan Commission was adamant about this, that the MOR guidelines should not mandate architectural style, that in effect they were intended to regulate the quality of development and the to prevent, for lack of a better term, big crappy vinyl boxes, but we're not intended to say, prairie style architecture is bad, revival style architecture is good, and so forth. Can you speak to the extent to which the architectural style was an issue at the DRB meeting?
Well, I think, again, the vote of the DRB was 3 in favor, 1 opposed, and the one opposing vote, his comments were that he didn't feel that the design of it really matched the overall character of the district, although it perfectly matches the existing church, but doesn't really match some of the structures around the area. So I guess in that sense, it was really an argument on the architecture of it. But the MOR design guidelines do ask the DRB to look at the overall design and character of what's being built, not to the specifics of the window treatments or some of the fine details of the architecture, but it's hard. The MOR design guidelines are filled with requirements to look at overall character, overall design, and it's hard to do that without getting into whether it's Victorian or Georgian or whatever it may be. But there were some other members of the DRB that stated that they want to get away from looking at the architectural design of it and look at more of the guidelines. So, but that was a lot of the discussion at the DRB.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions now, Ms. Pat?
Thank you. Just to follow up, if you clarify, Mr. Polsky, had there not been a request for variance, am I correct in understanding that anything having to do with what the Development Review Board looked at would not be coming before the City Council?
Right.
So, and in fact, the KC4 site is just about the variance. It's not about what it would look like.
Correct.
Right? Okay. Yes. And one other thing I wanted to clarify about floor area ratio, if you or Dr. Tyler wants to answer this. When I look at the picture in the zoning ordinance, it seems the floor area ratio is not about coverage of the lot. It's about the massing of the building. For example, the picture shows for FAR of .50. It shows a one-story building taking up half the lot. It shows a two-story building taking up a quarter of the lot. So it seems the floor area, and the definition of floor area ratio is the total, the quotient of gross floor area of all buildings on the lot divided by the lot area. And gross floor area is defined in the ordinance as the total area of all floor levels of a building. So my understanding is the floor area ratio is about the total square footage of every floor of the building in comparison to the size of the lot, and it's not about what % of the lot is covered. Is that correct?
But I had some other clarifications to make. I think that's true. It does deal not just with the coverage, but by extension, the height. And in other zoning ordinances, there are regulations with respect to density, which we lack. So we often, in applications, use FAR for that. Other zoning regulations also include bulk, and we lack that. So we, again, rely on FAR for density and bulk. Coverage is only addressed otherwise, well, also has other parameters being the open space ratio and the setbacks, but FAR also applies to coverage. So it's a simple concept that's used in many different ways in our zoning ordinance because it lacks other development regulations that are commonly found. So I think we rely on it quite a bit. And if I can just add some other thoughts here. And the second condition in the zoning variance criteria, I think what's unique and how that differs from the first is the question asked, is there an application to lots of other locations? And so that's an important question for a variance. Are you then opening the door for many other locations and situations? And that kind of begs the question, well, you know, what's unique here, or why were the regulations written this way? Is it generally applicable? Is the question there to other circumstances? There was a question about adding on to other buildings and what is the limitation on the square footage size. And it is, practically speaking, practical cap in the MOR district because of that FAR limit, and the limit of the lot area to which it may even be applied is still going to be just shy of 6,000 square feet. You just, without a variance of this nature, you're just not going to see a bigger building in the MOR district. And to get a sense of what that looks like, there's the bar building, the bar apartment building, and then the building across the street that's being constructed. So those are two different forms that show 6,000 square feet. And this proposal would be somewhat less than that. There was also a question about, well, could we, as a condition of the variance, say no more additions? And that might be questionable, but we oftentimes see conditions for variance asking for some type of process for any future planning efforts, and you could certainly identify something like that. And we do see that with institutional uses where there's may not be intentional piecemealing, but there's big long-term plans and then short-term plans, and it's beneficial oftentimes to set the stage for some, future cooperative planning with the community. So that might help in that respect.
Any other questions at this point?
Just one. Dr. Tyler, following up on this question about future expansion, which based on the proposed floor plan doesn't seem real likely, but in the case that the church wanted to expand, based on the fact that they'd already, assuming they do this, and then 20 years from now come back with a request to expand again onto this lot or adjacent lots, do you feel the case for special circumstance that's required by the zoning ordinance would be stronger or weaker in that case, in the case that you're making now? In other words, do you feel that the ability to plead a special circumstance is decreased by virtue of them already having availed themselves of this remedy?
It kind of goes both directions, actually. if this is such a unique circumstance that variance is granted, then it might serve as a precedent for other similar cases, perhaps for other institutional uses in the MOR. At the same time, sort of like the toe in the door type of situation, but on this site, you know, then you'd be looking at a much huger variance beyond what's being proposed.
I
And
guess
this,
what I'm doing is expressing some concern for the situation that Ms. Chenoweth brought up, not necessarily to my mind in the case of this particular use, but I would be concerned about creating a situation where, in effect, it were easier to basically develop piecemeal, thereby creating special circumstances. And I know there's a nominal provision in the zoning ordinance that a special circumstance can't be the result of the action of the petitioner. So I would have expected you to say that you would expect the case for special circumstance would be worse because they had, to some extent, any corner that they could argue 20 years from now that they had boxed themselves into would be a corner of their own making. And I would see that as a check against this kind of unfettered piecemeal expansion. The notion that the special circumstances would be harder and harder to prove as the petitioner, in effect, was the one who created the specialness of the special circumstances.
well, I think there will always be a record of this being granted if it were, so that history should be clear, and, you know, there were special approvals granted, and, you know, perhaps that would limit future opportunities. It also might make sense, you know, to provide some guidance for future possible expansions of the church, whether on different lots or it's something that we see with other in-city churches, that there's a need to expand because the church grows, but it can be very difficult to do so, and we do encourage more long-range planning, but it needs to be responsible too.
Okay, yes, Mr. Roberts.
It's my understanding that the house on, I don't know if this is the correct address, 607 Elm, which is directly behind the proposed construction, is also owned by the church at this time. And indeed, when the Korean, Presbyterian Korean Church, or I'm not sure what, I'm getting the name wrong, originally occupied the older home that has now been destroyed, have been torn down. They moved their services or some of their facilities to the yellow, this is the large 3-story yellow house that is behind the church. And that because they own that lot directly behind the new structure, they were able, and they're proposing actually, to change the lot line so that the new structure, it being so large, would that it would not naturally sit and meet the setback requirement, or however you want to call it, at the rear of the structure. So they're going to be asking to restructure that lot that is behind them so that there is enough leeway or clearance to build the larger building annex. And I'm wondering if indeed, I drove by the 607 Elm Street address. It is a large older home of, you know, interesting structure with peeling paint, and somewhat, it looks like it's kind of on the downhill ride at this moment. And I'm foreseeing that there'll be a time when it will no longer meet the needs of the church to have any facility there at all, and there may be a petition to bring it down or to perhaps move it to a new location. If that were to be done, if that became an open lot, would that lot be useful for parking, or would that lot be eligible then for the construction of a gymnasium or some other structure, freestanding or otherwise?
I think that's a question for the church.
Well, we have the architect here. Maybe he can express some of the. I mean, I'm sure he's had to deal with the change to the lot line, or he'll be dealing with that or proposing that. And I'm wondering if you can answer my question.
Regarding the lot line that we are setting back further north, The whole purpose of doing that was to have the addition set back as far from Green Street as possible, to more be in keeping with the MOR guidelines. The building could sit on the lot without that. This would allow us to achieve a feeling of open space in front of the addition. That's the purpose of that.
Has the church expressed any particular plans to you for considering further development on their property?
No, matter of fact, I think Don Mason will talk to you about the fact that they've improved the interiors quite a bit. The exterior, as you say, might need some more paint, but the interiors have been improved substantially. I don't think there's any plans at this time to do anything but use that building as it's currently being used.
No other questions? Mr. Olson, did you have a presentation to make?
I did have. I had some corrections which have been cleared up by Libby and others. I just wanted to say a few things about the process, and if there's any questions about the handout I gave you, it's all visual, so hopefully it'll be something that I can handle for you. This process with the church and your staff started over a year ago. Planning for this has gone back probably 2 years. But for the very beginning, I just want to point out that your staff, the zoning staff, the building code staff, the planning staff has been really excellent in advice and working with us, letting us know the process. I don't think they could have described the process as it really has turned out, because that was a unique situation. But we were advised, and I thought it was a great idea to meet with the neighborhood. That was done early in the process, and again on January 3rd, where the staff again was in attendance at those meetings to invite all neighbors to come and share the information about the new facility. The formal process began with a hearing in front of the the Urbana Historic Preservation Commission. I'm the chair of the Champaign Commission. I'm sorry I threw that other word in. But again, because we are right adjacent to the Ricker Building, and that's part of the requirements of your commission, it was a good response, and again, a lengthy discussion. And at the end of the day, they voted 4-0 in favor of this moving this project ahead. A few weeks later, we appeared in front of the Zoning Board of Appeals because we are asking for a variance. Again, the process, I commend whoever I think the mayor appoints, and you approve the different members on the commissions, but you have a good group of intelligent, well background people, and the different specifics that they have to be able to discuss this project in a thorough and a community-oriented way. That was again a 4-0 vote, and we went to the. I think we were the group that baptized the Development Review Board, because it was the first one that had been seated, and it was just, I think, appointed near the end of maybe last summer or the fall. It was a privilege to meet with them. We had 4. We didn't know what 4 would do to us, but as it turned out, again, good discussion, lengthy discussion. A lot of people came up to speak for and against it, and we had a 3-1 vote. Going back to the Zoning Board of Appeals, different scenario, different people involved, again, a unanimous vote. I may have counted wrong, but we had 18 affirmative votes and only 1 nay. But I think it's more than that. I think we have really had 3 different groups, commissions, and boards, all intelligent people, all people that care about Urbana, and they felt that this project was worth bringing forward and bringing forward to this council. So I just want to let you know how lucky I think you are to have such good boards, and whether they voted for us or against us, they really showed some open thinking, and I think that's very positive. Other than that, if you don't have any technical questions, I will bring Don Mason forward, and he has a few things to say to you. Any questions for the architect?
At this time, we can go to public input. Any other questions right now from staff? Okay.
Would Don Mason or yet or later?
Yeah, he can go right now. It's Reverend Mason, 707 Brighton. He's the Reverend at the Presbyterian Church.
Thank you. Our church, the First Presbyterian Church of Urbana, has shared a 30-year relationship with the Korean Church of Champaign-Urbana. It's come to a new and I think somewhat dramatic relationship in the last 18 months with the signing of a covenant to embark on a multicultural ministry that we would share together. And it takes several forms, but the most exciting one to us at the moment is the concept of two churches working together to build a Korean mission center, property that is owned by the First Presbyterian Church, but will be operated by, controlled by, and organized and facilitated and maintained by the Korean Church. This takes our relationship to a deeper level as we work together to serve our two congregations and to meet needs in the community. My main point is this. We've been in this location for nearly 150 years. We've been here a long time. We're about to celebrate our sesquicentennial in 2006. We've had 3 different centers of worship over that period of time. The current sanctuary has been there since 1963, so it's a 42-year place where we've met for prayer and worship. Of course, as it's been mentioned, the zoning regulations and the MOR district all came later after the establishment of the building itself. We have aesthetically pleasing, architecturally well-designed new building. We've worked very carefully with our architect. We're happy that the owners and the residents of the Ricker House, the historic site immediately adjacent to this building, have registered their pleasure with the design and the plan and have sent a letter to the city signed by Ronald Kramer at 612 West Green. We're happy that it's been affirmed by all the public hearings that have been held so far. Finally, we believe that it's compatible with the adjacent properties. We are happy to have the support of most of our neighbors. We're pleased that the architectural desire has been affirmed by, and the request for a variance has been affirmed by everyone who owns property on the block in which the building would be built, and also all the immediately adjacent neighbors to the north, the south, the east, and the west of this lot have all registered their approval. The only exception that we know about so far are the neighbors across Elm Street on the opposite side of the block, adjacent across the street from our education wing and next to our Springfield parking lot. Some of the residents of the Buena Vista Court have done us a good service. They've come to our neighborhood meeting. They've attended the open hearings. They've shared some good and helpful new information with us, not so much in relationship to this new building itself, but to some of the continuing problems that our neighborhood faces in the area of parking and traffic, and specifically some of the landscaping concerns about other parts of our property. We're committed to work with these neighbors. We've listened to their concerns. We've responded to them. We've asked them to serve on an advisory committee with our landscaping planners, and that process has already begun. We've been here a long time. It's a unique multicultural experiment that's not known in many other places. We believe it's aesthetically pleasing, and it's received strong support from the neighborhood. We do appreciate your careful consideration and hope you'll approve the variance tonight.
Okay, any questions for Reverend Mason? A lot of hands going up here. We'll start down with Mr. Alex and then move this way, Mr. Alex.
Yeah, Mr. Ron, his hand up first. Did you want to say something?
I would, excuse me, thank you. Reverend, I've talked with some members of your board, I received a letter from someone who lives at Buena Vista, and there was some concern about the shrubbery that was taken down by the people, by this particular couple that live at Buena Vista. And I'm just curious to know, some of the people on your board told me of their interest in establishing better communications with the people who live in Buena Vista, in light of the fact that you're planting new shrubbery, but also because of concerns that have been expressed for lighting from automobiles, et cetera, safety in the neighborhood. Is it your plan to increase and make that communication clearer and more positive and efficacious?
Very much so. That raising that issue is a good one because I think there are some very tangible, good solutions to the problems that are raised there. Concern by our trustees caused us to replace tall shrubs with shorter ones because of the safety concerns about people using the parking lot late at night and also the lighting issues. We didn't communicate well with our neighbors before we took the steps. A backhoe came in and removed the shrubs, and they laid bare for several, I think 2 or 3 weeks before there was any evidence of what was coming next. Since that time, we've contacted every member, every resident and owner of that Buena Vista court. We've gone on now 3 different times to try to contact each one. We're glad some of them have come to our meetings. And our intention now is to include them in the planning. We did spend quite a bit on the new landscaping. It will grow taller, but I think a good solution, one that's under good consideration now, is to construct a fence that would satisfy that concern.
I see. Well, thank you. I'm sure that they will be very glad to hear that. I'm sure that there's goodwill on both sides there, and just build on that would be welcome, I'm sure. Thank you.
That's our wish.
Mr. Alex?
I'm not sure to what extent this is something that we should be considering, because there's this issue on the table with regard to whether your variance being based on floor area ratio should be looked at in terms of how big the building is, or in terms of some additional factors like how many additional people is this going to allow to use the facility. To the extent that we're supposed to consider the increase in intensity of potential use that results from the expansion, can you speak to how you expect this addition to affect the numbers of people who are showing up for services or who are showing up for other programs at various times of the week? Because I think it is appropriate, given that we've heard comments from some of your neighbors about parking issues, traffic issues, and so forth, as being a common refrain in this neighborhood. How do you expect this addition, if it happens, to affect the number of people who are using the facility and the times at which they're using it?
We welcome that question. The facility is designed to meet the current needs. It doesn't anticipate the greatly expanded numbers of people coming. Over the past, I'd say, 3 or 4 years, we've just been out of space. It's a weekly challenge to find spaces for the existing groups to meet, neighborhood groups, groups outside the church, Boy Scouts, 12-step groups, and but the Korean Church itself is a vibrant and growing, very alive community of faith, and it's just no longer practical for the building, even had it been in perfect physical condition, to have met the needs for the current program. So I guess the answer is we need that space for the current program, and the 2 churches together, I wouldn't say we don't want to grow, we do, but the reality is at the present time, speaking for the First Presbyterian Church, we receive new members about at a rate to replace those who die or move away, and that's the trend we've had for over the last 15 years.
And I guess one more question, Reverend, related to the issue of parking and traffic and so forth. You've mentioned that you want to take steps to sort of mend fences with those neighbors who may be unhappy with aspects of your operation. What are you doing or do you plan to do with members of your congregation to try to make sure they understand where they're supposed to park and where they're supposed to go and where they're not supposed to go?
Well, it's our intention to keep reminding, we have in the past, keep reminding the members of both churches to obey the parking regulations, to use the parking lot. I think the evidence is that most of the church members, if not all, are using the off-street parking lots. And the problems about on-street parking are not the cause by the church, but by the high level of population in the apartment buildings in the neighborhood.
Just one further question.
Okay, Mr. Whalen.
I don't know how you can anticipate the future with teaching your people about the parking, but I'm certain that you will try. And I was concerned about that issue because of some people I know at Buena Vista before, and I think it is pertinent to show that this effort that on your part is one that includes goodwill. And if you look at the history of the church going back to Korea for the number of years, 100 years or more in their missionary work, this is an outgrowth of that in this city when such diversity, I should be asking you a question. Excuse me. Do you think that this plan of yours and this growth of yours will aid our diversity and our inclusiveness in this city?
Yes, I do. That's the main, that's the top of our agenda. I think the excitement that comes to our church is that the multicultural nature of Urbana will be illustrated by two Christian communities working arm in arm to share in mission, to share in worship, to share in outreach, and now to share in building a facility that we can work together with.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Chenoweth?
I have a couple of specific questions kind of on the nature of Mr. Alex's questions, which is how many members does the Presbyterian Church have?
The First Presbyterian Church of Urbana has about, I think it's around 410 official active members.
And the Korean Church?
Why don't we bring someone from the Korean Church to answer that question? Pastor Hong?
Just the number of members of who belong to your church?
Now?
Yes.
It's about 400 over 500.
500?
Including children.
Including, excuse me?
Children.
Oh, children, okay. And the seats in your current sanctuary, the number of people you're able to accommodate in a given session?
I think the sanctuary comfortably seats 350 people.
And the new sanctuary?
There will be no new sanctuary. Both communities will continue to worship in the same sanctuary, not at the same time. We have 3 services on Sunday, 2 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon.
Oh, so the addition is primarily a community center kind of addition?
That's correct.
Okay, and then how many parking spaces? I believe you have 2 lots. One is a small lot near the child care facility, and then the other is the large consolidated lot.
We actually have 3 lots. There's one, a small lot right behind the sanctuary on Elm Street. There's the larger one on across the street, across Orchard from the church, and then another one between Orchard and Springfield. The total number of 115 spaces.
115 spaces? Okay. What happened to the plan that I saw where the Elm Street building was going to become a gymnasium? It seemed, and there would be expansion into Orchard Street.
Yeah, there is no adopted plan about a gymnasium. The church has some dreams about the next 30 to 50 years, and we've talked about all kinds of possibilities. I think dreams is a better word than plan, and we don't have the property to implement a gymnasium there's on the space we now hold. I think we've illustrated this by investing a large amount of money into the Yellow House. We intend to have that there a long time and make good use of it and take good care of it.
And is it a rental property now, or is it church-related uses?
Right now, it's completely in use by the Korean Church, replacing, since the other house they were not permitted to continue in the other house.
Okay, so the Yellow House is referring to it has church uses, and will it remain as such?
I think the hope is that when the Korean Mission Center is completed, they'll move their offices and programs back into the new Korean Mission Center, and that house would be available for rent.
Okay, go back to being a rental. I know it was a rental before, just from walking the street. That's all for now.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
I'm sorry, I had one more, and that relates to this issue of adaptive reuse of these homes. And a thing we see a lot in this neighborhood is the MR, of course, part of the MR district zoning category was intended to promote reuse of structures. And it's been a pretty common modus operandi in this neighborhood for a long time for owners of rental houses to let the properties deteriorate more or less deliberately and then come in and say, oh, well, we couldn't possibly rehabilitate this house, it'd be too expensive. When in fact, the fact that the house had gotten to that condition was of their own devising. We've heard obviously similar comments with regard to this house, the question of whether it's something that, you could have foreseen the deterioration of this house and prevented it from getting in this state where, as I understand it, the power company would no longer provide power because the furnace was unsafe. On the other hand, I do recognize that many of these houses were not built to be historic structures, and that in many cases they included asbestos and things that basically made them sort of doomed from the start once they reached a certain age. And I'm wondering, could you speak to this concern we've heard that hey, the church is now asking to build on this lot when they're the ones who caused the single-family home to deteriorate in the first place?
Yes, I'd like to share a couple of examples of how the church has tried to utilize the old historic homes, and always working closely with PACA. I don't know if you'll remember the Cone House, which had a historic nature on it was a property the church bought that's now part of the parking lot on the east side of Orchard Street. And one of our trustees, and this was before any of these regulations were in place, rode his bicycle all through town to find a vacant lot, and a person who would purchase that house for $1 or $5 or something, and then it was moved, and it still exists today on East Green Street in Urbana, and it's a tribute to the church and the neighborhood to keep that historic building available for use. As to the 608 West Green Street that we're specifically concerned with now, the church invested a great deal of time, energy, and money in that building to keep it useful as long as it did. It served the family service program and then the Korean Church over a period of 20 years. And there are people in the room, the wife of the late Jim Strelo, who was a carpenter, who devoted many, many hours of volunteer work to completely renovate the interior walls and to care for the building. So the problems with the asbestos and some of those things were beyond our control in the basement and the furnace but I think we made an honest effort to keep that building useful as long as it could. It wasn't just that it's unuseful, but it's not practical for the purposes of the two churches program.
Any other questions at this point?
No, thank you.
Okay, we'll go to other public participation then. Thank you, fellas. E.D. Lee of 403 East Holmes.
Good evening. I am one of the elders at Korean Church. And I'd like to introduce our church very briefly and also explain why we need this new edition. Korean Church was founded in 1973 by about a dozen of the international students from Korea, of course, who came to the University of Illinois. In 1974, the relationship between Korean Church and the First Presbyterian Church of Vienna has started when Korean Church moved their Sunday service to the current position. Since then, the Urbana Church and Korean Church share the same facility, but not at the same time. Korean Church have their Sunday worship in the afternoon of the Sundays, and while Urbana Church have their worships in the morning. The partnership between those two churches are unique, very unique, I think. The relationship is enriching to both churches in expanding our faith as well as cultural experiences. The presence of two distinct congregations in one facility fits very well with the character of the city of Urbana. The city is made up of people, and the uniqueness of Urbana is due not by the building, but to the people. This cosmopolitan, multicultural group of people. Our two churches, being in the center of Urbana, is a visible sign of that aspect of the life of cities. Korean Church is also very unique. About 90% of our congregation consists of students, visiting scholars, and their families from Korea. Every year, about 1/4 of our congregation is being replaced. They come to our community for study and research at the University of Illinois. Some stay less than a year, while the other stays for 6 to 7 years. During their stay, many meet God and become Christian, and the others grow stronger in their belief. In addition, they learn America, American way of life, American value, and American culture. They are benefited a lot by the partnership with Urbana Church. Urbana Church is taking an active role in building bridges across two cultures and has been a good model for Christian citizenship for us. We deeply appreciate their generous sharing as well as their great vision of the mission. The location, being between Urbana downtown and the campus, is an ideal location for Korean Church, as we are largely our student population. The church's mission to serve the community and the campus is enhanced by the location. The congregation of Korean Church, while growing, has not and will not outgrow the facilities for some time. Parking problems were discussed many times, but shown not to be an impact by the new addition. Many of our congregation members are students, as I told you, but they don't have cars. The Korean Church leadership, together with the leadership of Urbana Church, made a commitment to stay on the present location, rather than relocate outside the city limits. It may be easy for us, Korean Church, to relocate outside or to buy an empty building with the fund we will raise for this edition. However, we decided not to do that because we value the partnership with Avena Church and the location of the campus ministry and the opportunity with cultural exposures. Korean Mission Center, when constructed, will be used by the same people who are already with those two churches. Nobody will move in from outside of both churches. Of course, we expect and we pray for some growth of those two churches, but same people will use it. I appreciate your attention as well. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Questions at this point? Okay, yes, Mr. Alex?
Just one. Actually, go ahead. Okay, I was just going to ask, do you share the same commitment as the Reverend of the Urbana Presbyterian Church to work with your congregation to try to make sure they understand where they're supposed to park and try to work out these differences with the neighbors? Because obviously it's not enough that the Urbana Presbyterian Church work out their differences with the neighbors. Your church must do that as well.
Of course, we love to use parking lot available for the church, and not the street parking. It is very hard to find because of student population in the neighborhood.
Do you have a feel for what percentage of your congregation walks or bicycles as opposed to drives?
Well, some walks, but mostly they share riding. Somebody has a car and they pick them up. Also, we have one church van, which can take about 15 people. So we just give a ride to the students. I think twice, before the Sunday service, and they give it back. So students, they don't have money, and of course they can afford cars. So of course some family of the students, the graduate students, they have cars. But what I'm saying is undergraduate students mostly don't have cars.
Thank you.
Questions, Ms. Pat?
I just have one question. How much do you anticipate your congregation would grow, say, in the next 10 years?
I hope we grow very quick. Then we can move out and build our own. But, it took us 30 years to reach at the present, situation.
Do you know how much it's grown in the last 10 years?
Last 10 years, I think it's about doubled. The reason is it is related to the exchange program or some admission to the foreign students by the University of Illinois. So they are not just coming, to do something else. They are coming here to study or to do research. So.
Thank you.
Questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Whedon, do you have another question?
Mr. Lee, 안녕하세요.
안녕하세요. Look at this. This is the cultural interactions.
When you started in '73, how many people did you have in your church?
I was not one of the founders, but I joined within 1 year, actually. So I have been here for very long. At the beginning, it's about, dozen students, graduate students. We were actually gathered together for Bible study. And suddenly, we need for, some, the worship together in Korean. so that's the beginning of this church.
And so that house was really a great godsend that you could work that closely with the Presbyterian Church for that long.
Yes, 74, we joined, we moved our worship place.
Yes, I remember. Well, thank you. I was just curious to know. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next is Maria Ryan, 1 Buena Vista Court.
Hi, I'm here this evening to express my opposition to the variance. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on some of the things that have already been said. One thing I would point out is that the neighbors to the north are basically Buena Vista Court, people who actually live in the neighborhood, and then there are several buildings immediately to the west of Buena Vista Court that are owned by Hunsinger Enterprises, and so I know that Hunsinger has expressed their support for the variance, and I believe that's probably what the pastor was referring to as the support of the other neighbors to the north. But I will point out that Hunsinger does not live in the neighborhood, so basically what you have is the folks who actually live there are having problems, and we don't want to see those problems get any worse. You probably all read my letters to the DRB and the ZBA that I wrote while this case was going through those various boards. So just in a nutshell, I'm concerned about some of the parking problems, and in particular about some of the traffic problems, and the fact that having this big of a variance is likely to increase, in particular, the traffic problems. The parking problems are still bad. They are certainly much better than they were in the wake of the new parking lot that was built a couple of years ago, although I do come out every now and then on a Sunday afternoon or sometimes on a weeknight when there's a church event going on to find somebody parked in my driveway behind my car, blocking my car. And I don't mean on the street blocking my driveway. I mean somebody actually pulled into my driveway behind my car. I know at the DRB meeting, there was some talk of establishing a dialogue with the neighbors, that the pastor got up and said that we need to do this. Then I got up, I talked about some of the problems I have. Then one of the other church leaders got up immediately after that and declared that there was never a problem with parking. I was rather surprised to hear this, because maybe it's not a problem for him, but it was sure a problem for me if I can't get my car out. And I will have to say that I would certainly welcome an opportunity for a dialogue to develop between the church and the neighbors, but thus far I don't hold out a lot of hope for that. Some of the history of the problems that we've had with the church, some of it you've heard from my neighbor Rachel with regard to the bushes being pulled out. I myself have had trespassers, both in the form of people pulling in behind my car, and I also came home one Sunday morning to find a middle-aged man and a preteen boy sitting on my lawn. And when I walked up to them and said, "Hi, I live in this house and this is my front yard," no apology was made. I was simply told that, "Oh, well, I'm conducting a confirmation class." Now, I didn't press the matter because I didn't want to embarrass the man in front of his student, but I was dismayed by the lack of regard for the fact that he was on my property, and that, perhaps he made a mistake and somehow didn't understand that this was a house where a person lives and set up his confirmation class there. But I would have expected that a show of respect would have been to apologize or to at least ask permission, can I complete the class or something along those lines, and none of that was offered. Again, I think it's important for the council to be aware. I don't want to say this by way of blocking dialogue. I just want the council members to be aware of what the situation is and what the track record is with the history of the church in the neighborhood and the relationship with the neighbors who actually live there, not necessarily the landlords who simply own property there and don't live with the traffic problems. Some of the traffic problem is related not simply to, the fact that there are several services a day going on Sunday and also various programs being run in the evenings, but also the fact that it's a mix of vehicular traffic and pedestrian traffic, and it really can be very difficult, to pull out of the driveway, and, you really do have to go slow and you have to be cautious. There are, as the church members pointed out, children. So, when you're looking out, behind when you're pulling out your car, that's another element of the situation. And of course, to have more traffic like that makes that situation more frequent. To have a bigger building that can support more programs would also lend itself to having that be a more frequent problem. Something I wanted to add to the letters that you that were included in your packet that were written to the DRB and the ZBA. When I wrote those letters, I really didn't understand a couple of important goals that the church had and that I have since heard them talk about at the meetings, including this meeting this evening, and that has to do with having kind of a synergy between the Korean congregation and the non-Korean congregation, and I think that's great. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that the city should be promoting. Some of the alternatives I suggested in my previous letters didn't really take that into account, but I still think that there would be alternatives where they could preserve that quality to their organization without having to go to the kind of variance that they're asking for. One real simple one would be for them simply to replace the square footage that they lost when the house was torn down, and instead of building something that's so much bigger than what they had, rather to replace what they've lost and leave it at that. Another alternative would be to look in downtown Urbana, that the downtown has excellent bus service for the students who are going to that congregation. It's not that far from where the current church is located, so perhaps to relocate down there, they could relocate both congregations. There may be some opportunities for them to explore some of those possibilities. Another possibility may be to stay at their current location without building an addition and look for space to run programs in, say, a downtown location, someplace that's a little bit farther away, and again, is away from residential neighborhood. Although the church itself is in the MOR, I'll point out that Buena Vista Court, which is immediately adjacent to church property, is actually R2. So we're impacted, at an even greater level beyond what our zoning is by the potential for this variance.
Brian, are you about to wind up?
I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Questions, Ms. Wyman?
I just wanted to follow up on the statements you had on parking issues. As you know, I used to live right behind you for about 2 years, and so also experienced some of the parking issues that you mentioned. The pastor from the First Presbyterian Church, I think, stated that the parking problem was not something just for Sundays, but due to the high volume of residential or the high residential nature of the neighborhood. And I'm wondering if, as my experience was that on Sundays it was virtually impossible to drive down the street or get out of a parking area because of blocked driveways and parking on what happened, I think, on both sides of the street, despite the fact that there's only parking allowed on one side of the street. And so I was wondering if you can speak to your ongoing experience, whether it's, as the pastor, I think, stated, only something that happens daily, or whether the parking problem is something that exists, especially during on Sundays and during church events.
It's certainly true that parking is tight in that neighborhood. It's tight all the time, and because there is a lot of residential, and there's some relatively high density residential. On Sundays and while there are church events going on, it becomes even worse. It's a visible increase in the number of cars that are parked on the street during those times, and it's because, gee, there's something going on at the church, and gee, there's a lot more cars on the street. You definitely see that ebb and flow that's related to the church events, to their Sunday services, and also things that go on during the week as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Alex.
I recognize your concerns about your driveway being blocked and this type of thing, and I think if I were had a neighbor across the street who was parking in my driveway a lot, I'd be pretty upset too. We have to take the Reverend's word for it that the church is doing all these things to reach out to the neighbors and try to resolve these problems. But we also want to hear your word for whether you think that's happening and the extent to which you think that's helped or not helped, or they've been willing to help resolve these problems or they haven't. And again, I'll frame this. I really feel like we're looking at this more as a zoning case and more is this an appropriate structure to construct on this lot based on the size and shape of the building and the size and shape of the lot. So I think we may be going a little far afield by translating that into intensity of use and presuming that it's going to make traffic problems worse and so forth, when in fact we may have heard that they're not anticipating an increase in use as a result of this. But it seems like you build more space, it's reasonable to consider that there's going to be some use. So what's your feeling as to how the church is doing in terms of helping you and your neighbors resolve these problems?
Yeah, I have not addressed them directly with the church. What I've done is when I found cars parked behind me, I will usually, write a little note on a piece of paper and say,
Stop.
I live here, please don't park behind my car. And I will say that it's never the same car twice. That it's, I think, individual people get the message, oops, I did something that I shouldn't have done. But I think just given the nature of that many people that you have, when you have an organization where there are that many people involved in it, it's very difficult to control everything that those people do. I think that's just the nature of the beast, that these are not, it's not a relationship of, say, an employer to an employee or a parent to a child where, they have to comply. It's, members of a congregation who can show up or not show up. They can park their car in places that the church might or might not approve of their members doing, but it's the fact of the church being there that brings them into the neighborhood. And also, and again, I think that there's some of it that the church, literally, if some of this I think is related to some of the growth that the church has experienced in the past 10 years, that there really isn't anything that the church can do, for instance, to widen the street to accommodate the traffic. So there, and that really is my point, is that I believe they've reached a point in their growth where they're too big for the neighborhood, and to grant the variance is to encourage them to grow even further and even bigger and even more out of proportion with the neighborhood. That Elm Street is a small residential street, Orchard is a small residential street, and if you want to have these kinds of traffic flows, you need some place to be able to displace those cars to. You need to have, an extra lane, and where are you going to put an extra lane?
Questions? Okay, thank you. Next is Jong Hwan Ham. And I'll remind folks that you've got up to 5 minutes.
I'm Jong Ham, pastor of Korean Church of Champaign Urbana. Since Kil Lee is elder in our church already explained, so I'd like to introduce myself and make a brief statement. My ministry has been 10 years in this town. This year marks the 32nd anniversary of the founding of our church. Our church has been worked with the First Presbyterian Church of Urbana throughout the past 30 years. Since our church is in campus town, every year many students come and go. 90% of our church members are students. Lots of students come to our church on Sunday by walking, by bicycle, by using our church van, and by using public bus. Our church steady growth owes undoubtedly to the unique partnership with the First Presbyterian Church of Urbana. As a Korean minister, I give thanks to God and always feel grateful to the support of the First Presbyterian Church of Urbana. Now we need a building space to maintain our ministry. So I cannot resist the exciting feelings about Korean Mission Center project. I believe Korean Mission Center would give a good influence to the community, and our community will be more beautiful looking. Thank you.
I do.
Mr. Roberts?
If the new construction is not going to provide your church with a different sanctuary space, how are you going to use the building specifically?
Yeah, it's a fellowship hall.
Fellowship hall.
Yeah, fellowship hall.
For
and it's a small
dinners, gatherings.
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, it's and it's office area. I'm sorry, my English is poor, so I can't explain it.
No, I'm understanding. Do you know what the occupancy is of the fellowship hall area?
Pardon me?
How many people can sit in the fellowship hall?
Oh, it's on Sunday, it's about 40, 100.
Okay. That's probably not I'm probably not asking the wrong person here. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
One question.
Mr. Alex?
What are you doing with your congregation to try to encourage them to park legally on these streets and not park in people's driveways and so forth? Do do you talk to your congregation about this, or is this something that you make an announcement during,
Yeah,
at the end of a
it's,
sermon or whatever, you know, please
Yeah.
help the neighbors by parking where you're supposed to park? Is this something that you work with your congregation to try to encourage them to do?
Yeah, every Sunday I pronounce this to our congregation to park at right position to. So yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions right now? Okay, thank you. Next is Brian Adams, 412 West Main.
My name's Brian Adams. I live at 412 West Elm.
I'm sorry.
Did I put Maine? Maybe I put Maine.
No, I just read it wrong.
Okay.
Yeah, 412 West Elm.
I live in the MOR district, and I've been here a couple times summarizing why we chose to purchase our house and move to the particular area. So I'll sort of go beyond all that and try to get right to some of the issues that concern us about the proposed addition to the church. One thing that a lot of people that live in the area have noticed, and people familiar with the area have commented on, and we've talked about it tonight here, is the ongoing destruction of some of the older buildings in the area and the replacement with very large box-like student filing cabinet style buildings. And really one of the things that attracted us to buy our house and move to the area was the historic architectural context of the area, and it's just been this continual erosion of that context, that ongoing erosion that's sort of gotten a lot of us concerned about this. And so when we were made aware of the planned addition to the church, again, we just saw the same thing happening. Again, old buildings were coming down and new structures were going up, which really, I don't feel, complement the existing architectural context of the area. Regarding the proposed addition to the existing church, I grant that it does complement the existing structure. My issue is that the existing structure is really sort of an architectural oddity in the area, and I don't mean that in a bad sense. I just mean that in terms of the bulk of the architecture along Elm and Green Streets, the church is really unusual. So from that point of view, I see the continuation of that architectural style at the expense of some of the older existing structures in the area as sort of a negative impact on the area. Again, one of the things that attracted us, and I'm sure other people who have bought properties and live in the area. One thing, again, the main reason for this discussion tonight has been about the fact that the proposed design does exceed the maximum allowable floor area ratio. So that's another issue that I think obviously should be discussed and evaluated carefully. As a property owner and resident in the MOR district, I fear that the approval of the current plan for the church expansion will set a precedent that could have a negative impact in the area. And this issue pretty much was discussed a little earlier, but I'll just express my views on it. Future developers, the church included, could destroy the unique historic architectural heterogeneity of the area by simply attaching proposed new construction to existing buildings that are not compatible with the surrounding neighborhood. Theoretically, the church could demolish the remaining properties it currently owns on Elm Street and replace them with structures identical to the existing church. The eventual outcome could be a series of sprawling structures and a limited number of architectural styles occupying several contiguous lots. And I know we've already gone through a lot of these issues, and hopefully this is still an issue that will be taken into account before you make your final decision. I would ask the council members to question if the proposed addition really adheres to the intent of the MOR design guidelines. I would also ask you to consider the issue of design criteria for additions to existing structures and the potential consequences of such criteria. In the case of the First Presbyterian Church, is an addition feasible when the original structure is so drastically different from the common architectural styles in the area? In such cases, should separate freestanding structures be the preferred solution to expansion in cases where adaptive reuse is not feasible? So in a nutshell, those are some of my concerns, some of the issues as someone who owns and lives in the area, would like to see brought into this discussion. And then one other issue I'd just like to comment on. I don't think any of us who reside in the area have any real problem with the church or its mission. It's really about architecture as far as I see it. I know other people have issues with parking, but part of the reason we decided to live in this area was because of its unique environment. It's close to the University of Illinois. It's close to downtown Urbana. It's a very cosmopolitan area in terms of cultural, ethnic, religious composition. So I sort of resent the drift of some of the arguments that by opposing this particular project on purely architectural issues, that somehow means that some of us are resisting the unique makeup of our neighborhood, and I don't think that's an issue at all. Thank you.
Okay, any questions for Mr. Adams?
I just had one, and this is, we may just disagree fundamentally on this, but this is something that goes back to when the Plan Commission was first here in the discussion of these guidelines, and some who were proposing the guidelines really seemed to feel that it was important that any new construction in this neighborhood match to the greatest extent possible what the other buildings look like. And of course, there is something of a mix of styles on Green Street. You've got a couple of these six flat buildings which don't really look like the traditional, Ricker House style homes. But I agree there is, to some extent, a prevailing architectural style in that neighborhood. Yeah. Do you think that it's important that the Development Review Board in this and in future proposals try to enforce this notion of architectural style? In other words, that new construction should not only be of high quality and be attractive, which was frankly my biggest concern with some of the stuff that was going up, but that it should, in addition, look like what's already there. How would you ask us to weigh those two, or ask the DRB, I guess, to weigh those two concerns? Because we had a big discussion, I think, at the Plan Commission. The catchphrase was, is your problem that it's big or is your problem that it's ugly? Yeah. When we were talking about some of these apartment buildings that were going up. Yeah.
Well, I was warned that this was going to be sort of a unique case, and obviously that's how it's playing out. It is sort of a unique situation. All I can say is in answer is that in the larger area around the MOR district, a lot of new construction has gone up, and those structures that have gone up, I think, have effectively utilized not exact one-to-one replicas of older structures, but I think they've at least made the effort to take elements from some of the more prevalent types of architectural styles in the area to pull together something that is more in line with what's already there. And I could walk up and down Elm, Green, Stoughton Street, where I used to live, and I could point out plenty of buildings that are large examples of one architectural style that's present in the area, and smaller scaled down versions. It seems like people have addressed this problem in the past and effectively come to some solution where they've been able to replicate a building using modern techniques and making it up to date, yet it still preserves the architectural context of the area.
Okay. Apologize for the digression, but it's just this DRB, as the petitioner pointed out, they were the first really case that's gone before the DRB. Yeah. We argued at length about, at the Plan Commission level, and I'm sure at the council level as well, about what these guidelines ought to consist of. And it's interesting to hear impressions about how they're actually being applied out there and whether they're right or wrong and what exactly they should say.
It's kind of tricky.
Yeah,
I found it tricky. There's a lot to take into account.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Next is Nancy Whaling of 2 Buena Vista Court.
Thank you. I have some of the same concerns that my neighbors do, in terms of the parking, traffic on Elm Street. Elm Street is a narrow street, and in my opinion, the usage is already too dense for that neighborhood. And I think that having such a massive structure extending 3/4 of a block along Green Street is only going to exacerbate that problem. I know the church members have expressed concern and good intentions about working with us and addressing some of these issues, but I don't think they've ever apologized to anyone on the east side of Buena Vista for leaving debris on Buena Vista property that those homeowners then had to clean up because nothing was done. I don't think they ever, directly apologized for that. They say parking is not a problem, but, it is for Maria. If there's a car in her driveway, it takes about 20 minutes. If you have to leave, it takes 20 minutes to get a tow truck out there. In the last 3 weeks, in spite, I'm sure, of their being aware that they will be under more intense scrutiny, because of these hearings, I have seen the church van parked illegally on Elm Street east of the no parking sign. And if I had film on my camera, I'd have a picture for you tonight. Unfortunately, I didn't. But, in spite of their saying they have adequate parking, it seems like maybe it's just a matter of convenience. And let's face it, most people, if they can park illegally next to the door, will choose to do that over parking a block away. And I think that it really isn't fair to members of both congregations to allow them this expansion, in light of these circumstances, because I think eventually they're going to find that they will need to relocate, rather than expand further. It seems like this is just the first step in a series that they've planned, and I think it will have a deleterious impact on our neighborhood. As you folks all know, I live in a historic district, and we were told at those hearings that we would have input as to what goes on in the neighborhood around us. Now, maybe since the address is on Green Street, that doesn't seem like it would have an impact on us, but they extend back to Elm Street, and, we're essentially right on top of them. So I would like to reiterate the things my neighbor, Ms. Ryan, has said in regards to maybe using some of the empty buildings in downtown Urbana for some of the programs. I know they have a number of programs that go on during the week, which, they plan to increase if they get this variance. And I know the former Whitaker's Jewelry Building is still empty and for rent. That space could be utilized. Green Bus goes right past the Illini Union, right to Lincoln Square. It would be very easy for people to take the bus to that location. If there's also the parking garage, which would be available. So I think it's time for them to explore other options. Thank you.
Okay, any questions? Yes, Mr. Roberts.
How many times have you actually had to have a car towed?
I don't park on that side. I park on the north side of the courtyard, and Ms. Ryan, who owns the house on the street, is the person, who is affected by their parking in the driveway, because she uses the driveway as a verbal agreement we have amongst ourselves that the people who live in the houses, facing Elm Street use the driveway, and then the rest of us park in our parking places, which are accessed off of Springfield. In reference to how many times have I had to have a car towed, I've called twice for a tow truck and was unable to get one. And there was one night I basically drove around for 3 hours because I couldn't find a legal place to park because someone was in my place.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Next is Ilona Matkovsky of 412 West Elm.
I would like to express my desire that the council considers rejecting the plan for expansion by the church, the Presbyterian Church, because I believe that by accepting this plan, we will further perpetuate non-compliance with the more requirements and guidelines, and we will further the deterioration of the historic neighborhood of Elm Street and Green Street. One issue that has been brought up here by several people in the council tonight has been the process by which institutes expand in residential neighborhoods. And I believe that the history of land acquiring and conversion by the Presbyterian Church is a very good example of how the process of residential neighborhood deterioration occurs. People have been concerned that land is bought up piecemeal and converted piecemeal, and eventually very large areas of a neighborhood are destroyed by this process. Why this process is slow and imperceptible as it is going on, more or less like cancer. You don't notice it until it's too late. This process is only noticed when it is so far ahead that the neighborhood is practically half destroyed. I have done historic research on how this church has acquired and converted land in the last couple of weeks, and I would like to share my results with you so you can see how this destruction occurs. There has always been a church on that corner. The first one was built in the 1860s, and it occupied one single lot. This church was torn down not quite 50 years later in 1901, and in 1901-1902 they built a new church here, a new structure, and this again only occupied one lot. In the late 1940s, there was a desire to expand the church, specifically to create and to build a new school building. And to do that, it was necessary to buy up land around the church. So the church had acquired 2 lots behind the one church that existed on the corner of Orchard and Green. One lot was empty. The other one had a house which had tremendous historic significance. I cannot go into that now, but if there was a building that should have been saved for its historic significance in Urbana, this was it. This building was torn down, and there was a school building built, which still stands there, is the brick building on Elm Street. Now we are dealing with 3 lots. This was not enough. In the 50s, right after this building was built, the church wanted to expand more, which involved tearing down the church building that stood there and acquiring still more land in order to build a new sanctuary and to build a new office building, which the church didn't have before. So the church acquired 2 more lots, both of which had buildings on it. One was right next to the church on Green Street, the other behind the church on Elm Street. Both of the houses were torn down. There was a very large rift in the congregation at this point because many buildings were very much against the expansion and the tearing down of the church building. Many members of that congregation left because they didn't see their wishes satisfied. The church went ahead and built the new church building. They left the school building there. With the expansion, the new church now occupies 6 residential lots, which is exactly a half a block. At the same time as this was going on, they bought 2 lots, a double lot at 411 Elm Street, West Elm Street, into which the church office moved and used this building temporarily for an office while the new structure was being built. When the new structure was completed, they moved out of this old historic building and tore it down and created a double parking lot here. About 3 or 4 years after they moved into the new church and the parking lot was used, they decided they didn't want that parking lot anymore, so they sold that land to a developer who put up a new 2-story shoebox-style apartment building there. Now the church needed a new parking lot, so they went and bought another double lot, and there's a double lot right next to Buena Vista Court. They tore the house down here, and they made a double parking lot. After this, they desired more parking lots, and this is when they moved. They acquired 2 buildings again on Elm Street at 507 and 511. One was the Cohen House, which has tremendous historic significance for the city again. And the building was...
If you got much longer to go, you're over your time already. So
okay, I will finish in a second.
Okay.
I appreciate that you listen to, because it shows how the neighborhood deteriorates. They moved the Cohen building. Unfortunately, we are not fortunate to look at it anymore. It exists not in our neighborhood. The building next to it was torn down and 2 parking lots were put in. The last 2 parking lots were put in 2 years ago in 2002 on Green Street. That was the next destruction of historic buildings. And then this year they tore down 1 more building for the expansion of the church. In sum total, now they own 17 lots. Of the 17 lots, 6 are occupied by the church and 11 are occupied by parking lots. Now they are expanding yet into another lot, and they have plans to expand all the way to Kohler Street based on the plans that I have seen drawn up for the church. Whenever that happens, I don't know. In any case, I believe the expansion of the church is great, and I congratulate them on it. But when a church or any institute expands to this degree, I do not think that they should remain in a residential neighborhood when their expansion can be only maintained at the price of destroying a residential neighborhood. I think it is time, and it's better both for the neighborhood and the church to move to an area where such expansion can be easily accomplished.
Okay, any questions? Okay, thank you.
I'd just like to
Sorry, go ahead.
I'd just like to say that I appreciate hearing some of the history of the acquisition of land that has occurred in the history of this church, which is far greater than one would picture seeing, the structures that exist. So I appreciate your research. Thank you very much.
I was going to say exactly what Mr. Roberts said.
Okay, any other questions? Waylon?
Well, like Mr. Dennis says, I certainly appreciate your research and your efforts. I'm just wondering, do you see any similarity between the expansion and growth of this church and the expansion and growth of the University of Illinois?
Yes,
Thank you.
absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
That's all I just...
Absolutely. I do, except we are in a residential neighborhood with family homes, and the context of these family homes is being completely demolished by a church whose constituency comes primarily and to a large percentage not from our neighborhood. They come there for Sunday meetings and go home to their comfortable residential neighborhoods, which are not being destroyed by parking lots and church expansion. Yet we have to live there and look at the parking lots. This expansion is wonderful, but it shouldn't be in a residential neighborhood. It should be in a neighborhood where there are no people living. In such close context.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you. There are no other questions.
Thank you.
Next is Richard Underwood, 2401 Pond, on the variance.
Thank you. Just to respond to our latest speaker, we have recently had a church historian, and the historian has made a great deal of research, and our church administrator also has session minutes that go back to time immemorial, and I think that it would be wise to check those before you accept Ms. McCloskey's account of the history. There are some points in there that I am told are simply not correct. I'd like to address a couple of points. If our building were only the amount above ground, there would be no need for a variance. It is not only above ground, it is also a basement. But the use expansion will be less than even a one-story structure would indicate. In other words, there's going to be no use expansion directly related to this building at this time in any foreseeable expansion. At least in my limited vision, any foreseeable expansion would be much less than that which could be accommodated in a one-story structure. So as far as the additional usage is concerned, I don't think that this exemption will have any effect on it. You have heard how we are a multicultural organization, and we are. You have asked about expansion of the Korean church. I join with the minister in hoping that there will be expansion, but frankly, I very strongly suspect it will be the other way. The United States government has seen fit to make it extraordinarily difficult for students to get visas. We're hearing from universities all over the country, including University of Illinois, that it's harder and harder to get foreign students here. And so, although I certainly hope and pray that he's right, I think that a more realistic view will be that there will be a decrease in that membership. The parking lot has been pretty well talked about. We're between the devil and the deep blue sea. If we want to have parking lots so that people are not inconvenienced, we have to have parking lots which are not very attractive. We're trying to make the parking lots more attractive. Unfortunately, we haven't found a way to make trees grow faster or bushes grow faster, but we are landscaping our parking lots and are planting trees and bushes to try and make them look as attractive as possible. And I do want to just mention the organizations and people that are using our parking lot right now. We have the Boy Scouts use it, the Church United events use it, the Christian Counseling Center next door uses it, the mosque uses it on Fridays. That's rather intercultural too. There are people parking there during the week that work at the University of University of Illinois and walk there from this parking lot because parking is so difficult on the campus area. The Red Cross uses it, and we have, in fact, 2 tenants of Buena Vista who park there regularly and who have expressed to us their appreciation for having the parking available. If anybody doesn't know that, I'll be glad to provide you the names and their apartment numbers. Also, people using the building. We have 2 AA groups working there. We have 2 OEA. I didn't know what that was, but it's the Overeaters Anonymous. 2 OEA groups meeting there. We sponsor the Boy Scouts who meet there. The Girl Scouts meet occasionally. The Pravina Parenting Group meets in our church. We have voter registration and voting there. We have a U of I child care resource meetings there. We have tax preparation training. We have a Korean language school. One thing that he didn't mention, the Korean church runs a school for Korean children, teaching them both Korean and English, helping them improve their English so that they can get along in this society, helping them to keep up with Korean so that when they go back to Korea and integrate into the Korean schools, they will be able to follow. That's a very, very worthy service. And most of the basement of this building that we're putting up is going to be devoted to that. So that's certainly a very important thing. And then we have a regular 5-day-a-week co-op nursery that occupies the second floor of what people call our school, our education wing. So it is a widely used community facility, and I have tried to do the arithmetic. I think that if there were houses built on each lot, which is now owned by the church, there would be far more cars trying every day to find on-street parking than is the present situation. I don't mean that the parking situation isn't obnoxious. That can be said about a lot of places in town, that it's very difficult to find parking place. But since the expansion of our parking areas, for example, I, coming to church on Sunday, have never had to park on the street, whereas before that, I often had to park on the street, usually down on Springfield, where I wasn't in anybody's yard. There's a question about...
Are you about finished?
Nope.
Your time is.
I demand equal time. What is the architectural context of the area? We have Victorian, colonial, Tudor, box houses, Spanish houses, and our church. So I really don't think that there is an architectural tone of our neighborhood. When the problem came with the hedges, our church administrator called at every house except apartment number 1, and Buena Vista left her card with both her phone and her cell phone on it, and said to please call if there's ever a problem with parking on Sunday. So we have tried to address that problem, and by the way, she did apologize. So I'm sorry that apparently the person who spoke here didn't know that that apology had done. Somebody mentioned that they were supposed to have input in this process. I assure you, because I've been at the meetings, they have had input at 3 different meetings. So this is not something that has suddenly sprung at them, but is something that they have known about and have had a lot of input on. So I do really hope and encourage you to consider this application favorably. We have worked very hard. Our architect is one of the founding members of PACA. He's also connected with the Agricultural Museum, and he is very much involved in preservation and keeping the good looks. And we feel very pleased with the fact that we have kept the building low so as not to obstruct the houses around, and that we have actually kept the distances from other houses as greater than the former house. Thank you very much. Sorry, yes?
A couple of questions.
Just one, and I don't want to pick nits here, but maybe this is indicative of some of the feeling that the Buena Vista folks have, that there's a disconnect between the church and them. You use the word apartments and tenants. You are aware those are not apartments or tenants, right? They're single-family homes.
Yeah, I apologize. I also am aware that they do not fit the architectural tone of the neighborhood.
That is, I mean, they're definitely part of the architectural tone of the neighborhood.
Frankly, I think the beauty of the tone of the neighborhood is its eclectic, cosmopolitan, diverse nature. I do not think that that is a Victorian neighborhood or a Spanish neighborhood or a Tudor neighborhood. It is a neighborhood of mixed architecture, which I like the diversity. Yes.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Do you rent the parking lot to the entities you were referring to?
Excuse me?
Does the church rent the parking lot?
No, we
to the
own the parking
entities?
lots.
What's that?
We own the parking lots.
No, do you rent it out to the
No, no,
entities
no,
you're referring
no,
to? So
no.
you allow those uses, but not for hire?
We do not receive any money for those who use them. We do not tow people who use them without invitation, except when we're having a very large gathering, such as when we had the Weaver funeral or on a Sunday morning. Otherwise, we don't tow vehicles that are there. And there are many, many from the apartment house that was the source of all of our troubles on the east, the students there who use our parking lot very regularly and who would otherwise be on the street.
Other questions? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That winds up our public input, unless there's anybody else I missed. Okay. Okay, we were on item number 1 under new business, an ordinance approving a major variance to allow an increase in the maximum permitted floor area ratio from .70 to .1.19 at 608 West Green Street in the MOR Mixed Office Residential Zoning District. So it's case number ZBA-04-MAJ-15. Is there, well, we've done with questions. Any more questions of staff at this point? If there are no other questions of staff, motion would be in order.
I'll move approval.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Ms. Chenoweth?
I'm gonna. I've spoken to the church and the neighbors, at least a representative of the church, and the neighbors who contacted me to tell them that I would request deferring this for today. And the only reason I request that of council is because I received a couple of things. One is we always get our packets on Fridays, and had a couple days to look at it. There's a flurry of contacts that I had from the neighborhood, and so I haven't had the opportunity to actually speak with everyone. The church, to their credit, has been trying to meet with me and I with the church for almost a month, and we have gone back and forth. There's probably been 12 iterations of trying to have a conversation. We have not had that conversation yet, and we also, I've not been able to respond to the people who have emailed me. So for that reason, I am going to ask to defer this to the next council meeting, but I would like to allow there to be conversation before I do that.
Any other discussion? Mr. Whalen, then Ms. Wyman?
I do not think it is appropriate to defer this in spite of the fact that Ms. Chenoweth has not been able to meet with anybody. I did, although I was very sick at the time. And I say, with all these people who have attended this meeting and who are concerned, and all the meetings that have been, this issue has been through, all the boards, it is time to decide on it and not delay it. And so I would not approve of that. And continuing that line of thought, I think that this effort is a has a motion been made to put this on the floor?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I was just outside, I'm sorry. I think that this effort to accommodate a multicultural, diverse communion of churches is a wonderful thing. It is something that we can use more of. We need that kind of communion, if you will, in our community. That kind of grace that it takes to build a holier society, something that we often see lacking. And I don't mean to sound too religious, but I do take this very seriously. I think the architecture, the question of parking, for example, first of all, small issues in some regards. Parking takes the cars off the street. And I go to St. Patrick's, and parking on the street is a problem. And I wish it wasn't, but we don't have enough parking lots. So the parking lots is an advantage. Second issue, the architecture. This building is monumental, and it's not only in size, perhaps, but also in its architectural attractiveness. To say that it's a cancer in our neighborhood, I think is misspeaking, because there are very few buildings of any architectural value, and including the campus of the University of Illinois, in our community. And there's so much money being spent on buildings. Today we have postmodern design, which is full of cliches from the past, arches that are not needed because of steel structures. This has the quality of a Frank Lloyd Wright building in its uniqueness. Its lines are very clean and clear. It's like a spire rising out of a prairie. Wooden buildings, frame buildings that we extol so much and think are so wonderful, were never built to last 200 years. They were built to last as long as wooden buildings will last. And we see pictures of old buildings collapsing because they are not meant to last. They were never meant to last. But this building will last. And this addition is not out of place at all. The church has been very cognizant of the interest of people in trying to keep the roof line, the ridge line low. The shape of the roof to be similar in nature to the existing structure. The use of the building, the FAR question, is something that has surprised me because I never thought of the FAR, the floor area ratio, as being something that would include a basement. I've always thought of it as something that would be of a high-rise nature and would include space above the ground that would be imposing on the neighborhood, more so than that which is underground. So I think the question of the FAR, which is an integral part of this variance request, is somewhat, should be looked at with a, a little kindness, perhaps, just accepting. In any case, I think that the time for this decision has come. The interest of the people who, in the Korean church and the Presbyterian church, who have come so far on such a long distance from Korea to blend themselves together and grow in our community, is a wonderful thing. And I don't see, the reason I asked the question, by the way, about the University of Illinois, I see the University of Illinois, say, west of Lincoln Avenue, consuming private property all the time. I see it consuming private property north of Green Street all the time. And yet there's nobody raising the devil about that. I see the University of Illinois consuming property and taking it off the tax rolls every day. And they don't pay anything in lieu of taxes. I see no hue and cry because of that, because the university is very special in our community. Well, so should this church and this community, this diverse and mixed community, be well accepted and welcomed in our community. And for that reason, I don't think it should be delayed. I think it should be accepted, and I support it wholeheartedly.
Okay, thank you. Further discussion? Yes, Mr. Alex?
I would also agree that I think...
I was going to recognize Ms. Wyman next. I've already agreed.
I'll be very quick.
Fine.
I just wanted to comment that I think some members of the public may not be aware that when a council member asks for a deferral, which means that it comes up at city council meetings and then must be voted at the next city council meeting, generally 2 weeks later, that's a courtesy that council members generally give. Again, as Ms. Chenoweth pointed out, oftentimes packets with information, including communications, to council members are provided. If council members pick them up Thursday night, if they're delivered in the mail Friday, and sometimes that's not enough time to appropriately be able to deliberate and communicate with people. I know I got one communication from one of the church members on my answering machine. Well, actually, I got, I'm not sure if it was this morning or this afternoon, but wasn't able to respond and talk with that church member before the council meeting, as I believe, as in-depth as she wished. I plan to second Ms. Chenoweth's motion for deferral, but wanted to make sure members of the audience were aware of what this meant. And also, just to be aware, it doesn't mean that you have to keep coming back to council meetings or to the next council meeting in 2 weeks, but rather just to be aware, we not only do we keep notes think all the council members keep notes on the comments that are made and read over the packets from the various zoning board of appeals, development review board meetings, et cetera. But that we also have your names and can get your names and addresses from the city clerks to be able to communicate with you further, and then are able to check out tapes of the council meetings to refresh our memory from the public library as well. So I hope it's not an offense to the church members that this is being done, but I think it's appropriate, one, as a common courtesy, and two, to make sure that council members, if they feel they haven't had enough time to either communicate with those who are being directly or feel they're directly affected by this, or have concerns about it, to be able to investigate this further. Thank you.
Just a procedural note, a deferral by the council is accomplished by simply a motion and a second. It does not require a vote, so it would not come to a vote today. If there's two members that want it to be deferred, it's automatically deferred by a council rule. So it doesn't take a majority of the council to do that. Further discussion? Yes, Mr. Alex.
I would also like to say I object to the deferral. I recognize that it's not may not be effective for me to object, but I think we've heard this case presented several times at various levels of the city. I think we've had ample opportunity to be able to make a decision at this point. I'll speak my piece on this, and in the event that this is deferred, which it sounds like it will be, I will vote, but I don't see any need for further discussion on my part. I see this as a relatively, on the face of it, a relatively limited case, as has been made. The point has been made repeatedly that in the absence of a request for variance on the basis of floor area ratio, this case would not be here at all. And so I try to look at this from the standpoint of what the zoning ordinance is intended to do with the floor area ratio restriction. And my understanding and certainly impression has always been that the intent of the floor area ratio restriction was to limit the scale and the mass of buildings in a combination of lot coverage, square footage, height, and so forth. And Ms. Pat was correct earlier. I probably stated this incorrectly. Certainly more than just lot coverage goes into floor area ratio, but it goes to the overall sort of volume of a building that you're allowed to construct on a given lot. And CARE has gone into deciding what those floor area ratios are for various zones in the city to try to ensure that construction that isn't overly intense for a given zoning district is prevented. When I first saw this case, I thought that there was considerable merit to the church's argument that this lower level space should not count, that basically you should be able to build 10 levels below ground if you felt like it because there was no outward visual impact on the neighborhood. I do understand, though, that there perhaps is a need to take into account to some extent the fact that more square footage means that it could be used more, could generate more traffic, and that's why I think we have to look at the individual plan. I think in this particular case we're not talking about increasing the size of the sanctuary, we're not talking about increasing by large volume the number of people who are potentially served, and so I would say that in this case the argument that the floor area ratio should not take into account this lower level space is appropriate, and I would support, on the basis of the recommendation from the ZBA, I would support the variance in this case because I feel that the intent of the zoning ordinance floor area ratio requirement is not to prevent the addition of lower level usable space, and in that regard I think it's an appropriate plan. Given the opportunity, though, I think this case has raised a number of important issues. One is it's the first test case for the Development Review Board in the MOR district, and I wanted to speak to the guidelines that were created to attempt to preserve the character of the MOR district. One of the things that I think is key in those guidelines is that they don't dictate a particular architectural style, that they recognize that there's considerable flexibility in how you design a building, provided it contain, it uses materials that are appropriate, it is of quality construction, and it is something that's going to be an asset to the neighborhood rather than a liability. I understand that opinions differ on the appearance of the existing church and therefore on this addition, but my feeling is that given that the existing church building is something of a neighborhood landmark in itself, having been there for 40 years and being readily identifiable as a component of that neighborhood, that the public interest is probably better served by an addition that is compatible with the existing church building than by an addition that is artificially trying to be compatible with some other uses on the block. So I think in this particular case, the architect has done probably about as good a job as could be expected in terms of doing something that is appropriate with regard, or compatible with the existing use, and not entirely out of place with the rest of the neighborhood, which is, as it has been pointed out, does have a variety of architectural styles in it already. That being said, I was disappointed to hear that Ms. McCloskey's comment about, churches should be someplace where people don't live drew such a laugh, because I think there's something that we need to recognize as a city, and that's that, obviously I don't agree with that directly, but there's a little bit of truth in that, and that's that if we look back to what a church was and a church building was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago, churches tended to be neighborhood gathering places. They tended to be small houses of worship where you'd have dozens or perhaps 100 people from the local neighborhood able to come to a local church. And a given denomination might have multiple churches throughout the community, and these were typically smaller uses. Something we've seen in the last 25 years is the prevalence of larger and larger churches, and I think the zoning ordinance of this city and of most cities allows churches to be built in almost any zone, as far as I know, basically in any zone in the city of Urbana, subject to various restrictions. And obviously, to some extent, this is recognition of people's freedom to religion, freedom to worship. But I think it also has some historical significance in that we view churches as an asset to a neighborhood, as a gathering place, as a focal point, as something that is something you'd want to have in your neighborhood, as opposed to something that you'd want to push out to the suburbs. But that being said, I think we need to recognize that as churches get bigger, and this is nowhere along the lines of a mega church or some of the things we've seen where they have they're building churches in urban areas now that are practically more arenas than neighborhood churches. This is probably a pretty typically sized modern church, but I think we need to recognize that these aren't just naturally compatible with single-family residential uses around them, and I think it will take a concerted effort on the part of the leadership of these churches, including this one, to ensure that they maintain a relationship with the neighbors. I mean, I think we need as a city to encourage these larger churches to recognize the impact that they do have on their surrounding neighborhood. It's clear that people feel like, we've got this church in our neighborhood, and these people just all come from outside the neighborhood to worship on Sunday, and then they go home, and they don't have any interest in the neighborhood. That's something that I think you as a church need to address and need to say, how can we work to be a positive force in this neighborhood rather than something that people see as an intrusion upon the neighborhood, because I think a church should be an asset for the neighborhood. And my final comment relates to parking. And with or without this variance, whether we vote on it now or next week or next council meeting, whenever, whether it passes or fails, it's clear that there's a parking problem in this neighborhood. And that, I don't think, based on my interpretation of the zoning ordinance, is something that's going to factor into my decision. But since I'm sitting here, it's something I'm going to talk about. And I think it's clear that there's problems with parking in the neighborhood. We all know that Urbana's parking enforcement, especially on Sundays, is not sufficient to get out and write tickets for everybody who's illegally parked in the city. And it takes basically everybody acting responsibly in order to make the parking system work. And I think I'm disappointed to hear, stories about the church bus parked illegally and things like that. I mean, to the extent that your parishioners are going to kind of park where they want, that's fine. But I think a church has a closer relationship with its members than a typical business has with its customers, and so I think you have an obligation to make sure that people are obeying the parking laws. This is inconveniencing neighbors if people are blocking driveways and parking illegally on the wrong side of the street. Parking on both sides of the street, if it's only permitted on one, is a public safety issue. I mean, we've got to get fire trucks up and down these streets. There are reasons why we have these parking laws, and I think you as a church should ensure that they're enforced. And it's a waste of police officers' time if we do have to send people out, because we don't have parking patrols on Sunday. Nobody's out there. Meter maids aren't out there writing tickets. So anytime somebody is parked illegally to the point that it's creating a safety hazard, it's a police officer who has to come out there and write the ticket, and it's a waste of their time, and it's a waste of city resources. So I would say I'm going to support this request for a variance, because I think in the context of the zoning ordinance it's an appropriate variance. But clearly, I think there are some fences that need to be mended with the neighbors, and I would like to see evidence that the church is going to take steps to try to be better neighbors in this neighborhood and to try to address some of these issues. And I don't have a feel for how serious they are. I don't know whether this is, half a dozen times in the last year somebody's driveway's gotten blocked and that therefore it became a big issue, or whether this is a real ongoing issue. But I think, you know that, and I would like to see that, to some extent in recognition of the city's being flexible in terms of entertaining this request for a zoning variance, we'd like to see some positive action by the church to try to work through some of these parking issues in the neighborhood. So I'm supportive of the request for the variance, and I would hope that we could look at some of these other issues as well. And as I said before, I don't think I need any more time or input to render a decision.
Okay, any other discussion, Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I have a lot to say, which I will not say tonight if we're not going to vote anyway. It'll just prolong things. But there is one point I want to make I'd like council members to think about before we vote on this again, and that is the issue of whether or not a basement should be included in computing floor area ratio. Floor area ratio includes basements. It includes all levels of the property. That is the law right now. And I believe that you could support the variance, granting the variance, without including the finding that the basement doesn't count. I think it is a very big mistake to include that finding because, and something we always have to think about when we're granting variances is not just can we accommodate this petitioner, but the next time a petitioner comes forward requesting a variance that you do not want to grant, that you don't think is appropriate, will that petitioner be able to say, we do not have equal enforcement of the law in Urbana because we granted someone else a variance based on the idea that basements don't count in floor area ratio, and now with this hypothetical petitioner in the future, we're saying, well, of course it counts, read the zoning ordinance. So I have other concerns about the variance, but I really want to encourage you to think about the precedent you're setting. And whenever we talk about precedents, people say, well, we're not a court of law. The precedent will matter only when the council acts to deny a variance, and the petitioner in the case whose variance is denied feels that he or she is wronged, then we'll point to other cases. So let's be careful about that. There is a reason the floor area ratio includes basements, and that's because if it's usable space, it's usable whether it's occupied, like in an apartment building, or whether it's used for, you could have another church that was going to use the basement for a use like a sanctuary. And you don't know that this church wouldn't either. So look through the findings. Before we look at this again, if you read through the case, if you want to vote yes, I think you can do that without including the finding about the basement, and I would encourage that.
Is there further discussion? Ms. Chenoweth?
I think the debate on the table in somewhat has to do with if FAR refers just to mass or to intensity of use. And Mr. Alex has said that he believes it refers to mass. And if that was the case, I would vote today on this. I would agree with you. That's not how it's not how I see it, and I kind of checked with staff tonight to make sure that there were other issues in terms of looking at FAR. For people who drive down Green Street, the mass is probably the thing that they care about the most, what it looks like. For the people who live in the neighborhood, intensity of use is really what matters. And there are lots of intensity of uses in that neighborhood kind of pushing from various directions. I think we need to be sensitive to that. I think that there's a way to potentially do this project with some conditions that help to mitigate the impact on the neighborhood. I haven't had the opportunity to talk to the neighborhood about those conditions. So we can do a kind of, up or down, thumbs up, thumbs down, and nobody's happy because, well, if one party is completely unhappy and the other party gets what they want, or there's a possibility, I believe, here for compromise, and I like to work towards situations in which there are compromise, in which certain things, issues that neighborhoods have raised, are addressed in looking at the way in which we move forward. So if I were to vote right now and there were no conditions attached to this, I would probably vote this down. And I think that there are a lot of things, a lot of positive aspects to this development, and I think that would be regrettable. I don't know how other council members will vote. So I'd like to see if there's some way in which I can talk to the individuals involved in this to make something happen that could be potentially mutually agreeable. And that's why I'll be asking to defer this.
Are there any other discussion at this point?
I'll make a motion. I'd like to move to defer to next council meeting.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. As I said before, with a motion and a second to defer, that's automatic. And we'll see this at the next council meeting, which would be in 2 weeks' time. Thank you, everyone, for your patience and persistence tonight. Under new business, an ordinance approving a revised annexation agreement, Higton and Naugle annexation, south side of Colorado Avenue, approximately 394 feet east of Philo Road, plan case 1871-A-03. Mr. Kowalski?
Thanks. I'll actually do a presentation for the last two items on the agenda because the last item for the combination preliminary and final plat is related to this case. But they do need two separate actions. This is for the Prairie Winds development on the south side of Colorado Avenue, east of Philo Road. I'm sure this looks familiar to you. It's the third time you've seen it. It was originally approved in 2003 as a planned unit development for a 70 to 75 unit senior retirement center along on one lot. A second large lot was going to have 38 condominiums around a private road called Prairie Wind Circle, and those were in a mix of duplex and fourplex buildings. And then the third component of the development would be a standard single-family subdivision of 29 lots. That was approved in 2003. In 2004, there was a change that came before you, change in the layout of the condominium portion of the planned unit development. It was still all proposed to have all these condos on one lot with a private road, Prairie Wind Circle, although the layout changed slightly. Some of the buildings shifted, and there was an increase from 38 to 42 units. That was approved, and a subdivision was approved to that effect also. The latest and hopefully final revision to the plan is to reconfigure the condominium lot, and instead of having one lot with the 42 units on it, it would be divided into a common lot line subdivision. So, and the road would be switched from private to public. That's Prairie Wind Circle. So the difference is, although there's no change to the physical layout of the infrastructure. In fact, the street is already built, and it was required to be built to public standards as part of the original annexation agreement. There's no physical difference to where the buildings will be placed, or they're no closer to the property line, which was one of the biggest issues at the last meeting. But the difference is really taking this one lot where people buy the interior of a unit as a condominium, and they would be subdivided into the common lot line according to our common lot line subdivision provisions, and you would buy the unit and the lot that goes around it. Although there would be a homeowners association that would likely, maintain the grass areas and landscaping, et cetera. In order to accommodate that request, we did need to change the annexation agreement because there was specific reference to how this subdivision was going to be approved and that the road would be private and not public. And also, you had approved a preliminary and final subdivision plat that only included one lot for all the condos, and now that that's coming back and it's going to be 43 lots, that needs to be reapproved as well. These are the kinds of things we would typically try and address administratively where we can, but it was obvious in reviewing the prior approvals that this was something that was going to have to be reapproved, the annexation agreement and also the subdivision plat. The reason the road has to go from private to public, we have a requirement in our subdivision codes that all lots shall front on a public street. And the way we had it before, we had one large lot with all the condominiums on it, and it fronted on Colorado Avenue, and that was essentially a public street, and that met the requirements. This way, with the 42 new lots, they will front on Prairie Wind Circle, but it was to be private, and to meet that requirement, the street would need to be public. The Plan Commission heard this case at their last meeting and did not forward an official recommendation to the city council because they voted on it 3-3. A couple of the commissioners had some general questions and concerns about the road being turned from private to public, and if it were proposed to be public from the beginning, would we have approved and chosen that layout for the road, the Prairie Wind Circle, which is a loop road. We had a good opportunity to review that question with our city engineer, Bill Gray, and also our engineering department as a whole, and it's really the opinion of the engineering department and city staff that the road is perfectly acceptable as a public street. Again, we did require it to be built to public street standards. It's 25 feet in width, curb and gutter, appropriate sidewalk, although there was a partial waiver granted for sidewalk as part of the original annexation agreement. But it is built to public standards, and it's not the opinion of our city engineer that the road is any kind of insufficient layout that would be unacceptable for the city to accept. As well as accepting the street for public purposes also allows ensures the performance of basic services such as snow removal, sweeping, routine maintenance, etc. So the other aspect about the road, when it was originally proposed to be private, it was proposed that way in large part because it was desired to have a gate that would allow only residents who live in there to flash a key or whatever and be able to get in. There would be no gate blocking access to the road, of course, as a public street, and it would be open to the public. So, those your staff report outlines the findings that were presented at the Plan Commission. I'd be happy to answer any questions. I know Paul Tapman is here, as well as Steve Horvey, who represent the development.
Questions for staff, Ms. Fapp?
Thank you. So the essential difference here is who pays for the street, is that right?
Well, who pays for the maintenance of the street long-term, I guess. The street is built and constructed, right, which has been paid for by the developer.
But if we were to approve this, then the city would have to reimburse the developer, is that right? No.
No.
Oh, okay, so...
The street is built and paid for by the developer. It would just be a question of it being dedicated to the public and owned and maintained by the city. I mean, it's a brand-new street, so we don't expect to have to resurface it in the next, 20 to 30 years.
Do we have a dollar figure as to what it costs us to maintain a street like this?
Might need Bill's help on that a little bit.
The cost to maintain the street, I would have to do a little research on that. There are, street sweeping and snow plowing costs. I could, give you those costs. We have those costs per mile, per lane mile, in the records we keep. But if that's what you're asking for.
That's what I'm asking, but that's not something you have handy tonight.
I don't know.
Thank you. I guess that's all I have with questions right now,
Mr. Kowalski, it sounds like from your comments that it's not possible to, say, approve the division so that there's common lot lines and not approve the changing the private street to the public street based on what the zoning ordinance requires. Is that right?
It's the subdivision ordinance that essentially requires lots to front on a public street. Mm-hmm. An option would be that could be a waiver that could be requested and granted, but in general, I think it serves the long-term interest of the city better to have lots that front on public streets that can be maintained in a public fashion, similar to most everywhere else in the city. There are only a few, probably rare exceptions citywide, and Bill might be able to help me out on this a little bit too, such as, say, Florida Court, where we have lots that front on a private street, and those may or may not be built to acceptable city standards. But for the most part, by and large, properly subdivided lots are on public streets. So,
if the council were to deny this proposal, then this could stay or would become a gated community. Is that right? And there's still that right, if this stays a private street, to be a gated community. Is that right?
If it's a private street, yeah. I mean, the trigger for removing the gate is really if the street's going to be public, it can't be gated.
Right.
If it's private, it could be.
And so that's, I suppose, the advantage then, making it public. Though it would be, there will be some cost to the street maintenance, down the road and the snow removal and that sort of thing, the advantage would then, it would be a public street,
Yeah.
accessible by the public.
That's one of the advantages. I think the other interest of the city to have the street public is the long-term interest of people who live there. I mean, it's more and more common, we're just starting to see it a little bit in Urbana now, but nationwide, it's more and more common for homeowners associations to come back to a city, 15, 20, 25 years after a scenario like this is approved and say, hey, we didn't realize what was it, we were going to be responsible for doing, and it's really getting difficult for, just these 40 households to do this. Can you please take over this street? And it was never really intended. Now, where that really gets to be a problem is when the street wasn't built to city standards in the first place, but it's staff's opinion that long-term interest to have the street as public would serve the overall interest of the public a little better.
Thank you.
Any other questions, Mr. Roberts?
I'm thinking of an instance that I came across in my ward, walking at, if I can remember the address, 608 South Glover, which is an extension directly to east from Glover itself into a very long lot on which there are 6 cottages. And my understanding is that it's a private street to this date. But it serves 6 different homes. And I'm even believing that the ownership of the entire property has changed, and there might be 2 or 3 different property owners now who own individual homes on that street or combinations of such. And it is a truly forgotten street in the sense that it comes off of Glover at a perpendicular angle and then becomes like a country lane, and then it becomes rubble with potholes, and it hasn't been upkept for probably 40 years or something. So that's an example of what may happen to a thoroughfare if left to as a private lane, where ultimately the ownership of it abandons any kind of upkeep. And so I'm thinking if these are new construction, this is new construction, it would probably be wise for the city to assume ownership of the street and maintain it in a dual way, because not only is this connecting to the loop called Prairie Wind Circle or whatever, but it also is connecting to what's going to become a senior citizen center or some other kind of development which is yet undisclosed. And it would be peculiar to have a street right off of Colorado Boulevard extension, retrograde over a period of time. So I don't know. My opinion is it doesn't seem wise to promote public street maintenance.
Ms. Chenoweth?
Do we have a motion on the table?
No, it's questions right now.
Okay, could I make a motion?
Sure.
I'd like to move approval.
I'll second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? Ms. Chenoweth?
It's always bothered me that this was going to be a gated community, and I'm pleased that we have an opportunity to actually keep that from being the case. I also I generally agree that public streets are good. We have to pay to maintain them, and we have to snowplow them, and that means that the quality of life for the people in that neighborhood is good, and the quality of the streets, it tends to be higher than in private development. So as long as there is not significant costs such as us purchasing the street or us having to pay for the street retroactively, I don't see financial consequence. That was my main concern. My first reading of this, I misunderstood what was on the table. I understood us to be paying for the street. I don't know how I got that, but that we would be paying for the street and that it would be gated. Maybe that's what happens from not sleeping enough, but I think that this is a fine. We should move forward.
I would second that. Oh, what's the discussion?
I just have one quick comment for you, Robin. This I think this has always been a great project. I think it's still a great project. I understand the developer's desire to convert from, sort of condominium style ownership to fee simple lots. I actually think that's probably a better model in terms of getting ownership in the neighborhood and so forth. So I applaud that. I understand some of the concerns the Plan Commission had in terms of whether the layout of the streets would be appropriate if we'd done all this outside the context of the PUD ordinance, but I think it's just one of these live and learn type situations. My only question was whether we've looked at the way the PUD ordinance interacts with the subdivision ordinance well enough, because it seems like the notion that you can't create a PUD in which there's fee simple ownership of lots is probably something we ought to consider, because somebody someday may want to do this again. And there's great things about the PUD, the fact that it lets people create communities that integrate different kind of uses and get out of some of the traditional zoning requirements, but at the same time, create something that probably works better as an integrated community. So I'm all in favor of PUDs. But if the PUD ordinance is tying developers' hands to the point that they can't have fee simple lots within these PUDs, that might be something we'd want to look at for a future revision of the PUD ordinance. And maybe we feel it's bad. Maybe we think that that all lots, anything that you own, should be on a public street, which is what the subdivision ordinance says. But I'm just worried that we haven't really considered how the notion of privately owned lots within PUDs, and maybe we ought to.
I think you're right, and we will be presenting in the new comprehensive plan an implementation item that asks us to take a look at our PUD standards, because they're really designed for two things: a commercial strip mall and a Melrose type of apartment development. And it's kind of hard to really make it work with these kinds of
Because I thought this was a classic example of a situation in which you'd want to use the PUD ordinance, but as it turned out, it didn't really work for the developer, and I think we ought to look at how we can make that better.
Any other discussion? Ms. Pat?
Thank you. I don't want to drag this out because it's late, and I had come in tonight thinking that maybe we should put this off, but I understand that's going to upset the developer, and I don't want to do that. But it's not very often that the Plan Commission does not recommend approval of something. So when that happens, that gets my attention. And there are a number of issues raised here that I think, I would like to feel comfortable with. The fact that Dr. Hopkins thinks that this is a bad design, sets a bad precedent, and is not good planning does concern me. I am, like Ms. Chapman, I'm pleased. I had assumed that there was the issue of our paying to build the street, and the fact that the city would not be doing that really lessens my concern here. But I would, if Mr. Kowalski, if you could just address another question about the point that Mr. Hopkins raised about the properties, the right-of-way abutting the backyard of adjoining properties. Mm-hmm. And I believe somewhere here you said that in most cases the city tries to avoid that, but there are some places in the city where we have that. Could you just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Mr. Hopkins' concern was the loop road layout, and especially on the east where it does back up to the lots that would front on Lucas Street, creating a double frontage situation. It is true that in general we try and avoid double frontage lots, although in new development we're able to restrict it to a point where we will not allow these lots that front on Lucas to have access onto the new Prairie Wind Circle Road behind them. It is still the proposal of the developer to have a wrought iron gate, if you will, around the perimeter of the property, not across the street. But so we don't anticipate there would be problems where people are, especially in new construction where the garages are going to be facing the street, where there's going to be a desire for people to start driving off the backyard and onto a street behind them. So I think overall, in general, we try and avoid double frontage lots where we can. There's plenty of scenarios where we have them around the city, although they're not the norm. So I think that was really getting to what Lou was concerned about at the Plan Commission. He did have a concern also about Prairie Wind Circle up on the north, how it creates a kind of a frontage road system, if you will, on Colorado. The reason the road lays out the way it does is because of the need for the large detention basin in the middle of this lot, which is really the low point and serves drainage for this entire 31 acres. and the desire to have the system of condos kind of back up to that water feature, if you will, that will have a walking path around it and also serve as a walking path for the retirement center. So if you have the detention there and you lay the lots out around there, the most logical layout for the road is to serve all of those lots in a loop. And it does create some double frontage, but not to the point where we think it's going to be an access problem.
Yeah, I see his point about the parallel streets. I have a problem with that. I know you just said it, but can you make clear to me what would prevent property owners from using what we're thinking would be their backyard as access onto the loop road rather than, like, what prevents them from putting a driveway in off of the loop road instead of putting, either in addition to or instead of the driveway onto the road that you're expecting them to?
Well, there's a bunch of ways that we would catch that. Number one is if somebody wants to install a driveway onto a public street, they have to get a permit from engineering to do so. And we wouldn't, I don't want to speak for Bill here, but we wouldn't grant that permit if it's explicitly stated on the plat that there shall be no access onto Prairie Wind Circle from lots 1 through 6 of Lucas Street.
Okay, so that it would be, that's not something discretionary. That would be basically unlawful to allow it, right? 10 years from now, if somebody wanted to do it, would it be no, it can't because it was part of this plat?
I guess if it was on the plat, that would be helpful for future issuance of permits, but yeah, I guess it's to some degree up to the developer. I mean, they may want to have a backyard, garage or something, and access could be off that road, I guess, and not off the other street. So, I mean, we wouldn't prohibit it necessarily. Again, there are some scenarios where we have a lot with a street on both sides of the lot, and sometimes that access can be off one or the other street, but the developer can dictate how he'd like that access to be, and if it's off this street to the east, that's fine, and we would do it accordingly if that was so stated on the plat. But I'm just saying, there's nothing that says you can't do that.
And that was Dr. Hopkins' concern. I see that. Where is the fence? What does the fence go around? Does it go around the entire area?
The fence would wrap around the condo site. And my understanding, and Paul, if I'm incorrect, you can back me up here, but that there would be a homeowners association created for this condo lot that would be responsible for maintaining the basin. And they'll probably be commissioned to cut the lawns and not that kind of thing that you typically find in a common lot line development, such as the Atkins development down on Amber Lane and Lydia Court. So it still is the plan to have the wrought iron fence that surrounds this property, although not gate across the street. So the presence of the fence itself would, deter people from using that as an escape, I guess. But I think probably just the physical layout of the homes that will pretty much fill up the lot. I don't think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to be able to drive your car around the side of the house, which may have a 5 to 8 foot setback or so, and use that backyard area for parking, et cetera.
So the fence, now Prairie Winds Drive and Prairie Winds Circle are the same street continued, is that right?
Right, it just has to have a slightly different, it just has to have a slightly different name for addressing purposes and for emergency response.
For addressing, okay. And so Prairie Winds Circle and Prairie Winds Drive would be inside the fence?
Correct.
Okay. If that's the case, is that what you were saying before? Then the houses to the east couldn't have a driveway access onto Prairie Winds Circle because the fence is blocking them. Is that right?
Right.
Okay. All right. I'm with you. Thank you.
Any further discussion?
I was just going to say, with regard to the, do we prevent which side has frontage on which street, the developer can impose restrictive covenants that go with the land to specify that, and I'd expect it's an intention to do that.
Any other discussion? Like the,
I have one.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Can you explain a little bit about the space between the south part of the Prairie Wind Circle Drive and Colorado Boulevard? It looks like there's a sidewalk that weaves through there. Is that correct? Am I reading the layout correctly? There's a sidewalk that goes along Colorado Boulevard, and so there's not a ditch or there's not a berm. There's just a flat space, and there's a sidewalk.
There will be a sidewalk on, a 5-foot sidewalk on the south side of Colorado Avenue, and there will be a multi-use bicycle path on the north side, bicycle and pedestrian path on the north side of Colorado. There will also be a sidewalk along the interior of Prairie Wind Circle that would connect all the homes, and also one in front of lots 65 through 72, where there are lots on the outside of Prairie Wind Circle, down in the bottom left corner. So all of the homes would be served by a sidewalk, as well as a path around the detention basin as well for recreation, more than access to somewhere. So all of the homes have a sidewalk access up to Colorado.
Okay. Any other discussion? I'd just like to add that with the discussion between private roads and a public road, even though we do have to maintain it with street sweeping and snow plowing and so forth, we do have to dedicate city time to talking to residents' concerns about private streets and private sewers, which we run into every now and again in certain areas of the city. Not only do we have situations such as Mr. Roberts mentioned, where you see the degradation of a private road over a long period of time where it just doesn't get the attention that it should, but a lot of the time people assume that what they have a public street or service, and it's actually a private road or private sewer service, and they're very disappointed when they find out that it's their responsibility and not ours. And we end up spending an inordinate amount of staff time dealing with those individuals. It's not time driving a snowplow or driving a street sweeper, but it is time educating them as to what their own responsibilities are, what the peculiarities of their layout on their street are, and educating them to what their responsibilities are when that happens. And so that can be very time-consuming, and generally those are not pleasant meetings, because the residents are generally disappointed that they don't have the city services that they expected. So it does make sense to have this be a public street rather than a private street, in my mind. Any other discussion? If there's no other discussion, will the clerk please call the roll? This is on item 2 under new business.
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Shenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes?
Yes.
Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
Motion carries with 7 ayes. A related item is item number 3, an ordinance approving a revised combination preliminary and final subdivision plat, Prairie Wind subdivision, south side of Colorado, approximately 394 feet east of Philo Road, plan case 1902-S-04.
I move approval.
We have a motion for approval and a second. Any discussion? If there's no discussion, will clerk please call the roll?
Mr. Alex?
Yes.
Ms. Shenoweth?
Yes.
Mr. Hayes? Ms. Pat?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Whalen?
Yes.
Ms. Wyman?
Yes.
That motion carries with 7 ayes. And finally, this evening, an appointment to the Historic Preservation Commission. It's my pleasure to recommend Mary Stewart of 404 East Washington to this commission. She is currently on the History and Philosophy librarian and professor of library administration at the U of I. She's been at the U of I since the late 70s. Received her master's in library science from the U of I in '78 and an all-but dissertation in history in 1998. Longtime resident of Urbana, who in my interview with her exhibited a strong interest in historic preservation. If approved, her term will expire June 30th, 2007. And my understanding is that she will meet some of the professional requirements for us to be a certified historic preservation community. So she does meet those some of those professional criteria.
Second.
Motion and a second. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. And with that, we stand adjourned. Thank you and be sure to get out to vote tomorrow.
Dennis, did you have the last committee meeting, or did?
I did.
You did.
Yeah, they stuck with us the
So
whole
Joe
time.
did that.
Joe's turn.
I'll make sure it wasn't mine.
Do you think you'll get one?
No, I know, well, this is, okay,